whose interest does it serve? Whose should it serve? Often, organizations have unbalanced incentives to use personal information solely for their own interest, to the detriment of individuals or even society as a whole. Much has been written about the surveillance economy and how organizations capitalize off of measuring the online and real world behaviors of individuals. We, all of us, are being observed and quantified to new extremes with both potential benefits and new potential for harm. The use of observational insights is not a new phenomenon. The course of human progress has been built on the scientific method, which relies on observation and quantitative measurement, the measurement of reality itself, the physical world, and certainly individual persons. For example, early healthcare depended on noticing that when someone ate one thing, they were ill, and then another thing made them feel better. Early agriculture meant noticing patterns of stars and the resulting changes in seasons, seeing the trend and taking advantage of the pattern. Modern data protection laws give rights to individuals through a personal sovereignty or decision-making power regarding the various facts and statistics that refer to them. But in giving individuals the protection of the state or a right of ownership over observations about themselves, are we in fact giving them a sovereignty over a slice of reality or the ability to control how others may perceive the world? How far should that ability reach? Analogies about data tend to refer to it as a resource for science or industry, such as oil or electricity. I find it useful to think of data in the analogy of shared spaces as a new commons, with both the benefits and the tragedies that comparison implies. Historically, anyone in a community could potentially access or use a common resource, like grazing land, and no one can exclusively own it. This means the resource could be abused in ways that harm people because no one has direct responsibility. Yet another problem that exists today in the context of data. In the past, we as a global society have had to come together and decide what should be a common resource and what could legitimately be claimed by only one party. At the Global Privacy Assembly, as we look out the windows here in Bermuda, we're struck by views of the sea. The oceans are a global resource for transportation, aquaculture, or other shared purposes. When faced with the question of how much of the ocean a country can claim, early modern nations judged that the distance a weapon could reach was a reasonable measure of control of that slice of the common ocean. The distance that a cannonball could be fired from the coastline at the time was about the distance to the horizon. Setting aside the merits, this consensus provided a clarity on the norms of one party's reach and allowed both sides to understand one another's expectations. As time passed and technology changed, the consensus definition for sovereign territory gradually expanded until humanity reached a general agreement under the 20th century law of the sea. Humans needed similar agreements when we began to regularly explore and inhabit new spaces, such as the only continent without an indigenous population, Antarctica. In that case, a treaty system helped establish a consensus on expectations and norms for how the region may be used for scientific research purposes. Threats from militarization and zero-sum competition have been largely avoided to allow access and progress for the world to benefit from. In a similar way, the Outer Space Treaty established an agreement that one group cannot claim ownership over celestial objects, and instead we should consider the use of these resources for all humankind. We are fast approaching, if we have not already passed, the point where that conversation is needed in terms of data, algorithms, inferences, profiles, and other uses of observational technology. A claim of exclusive ownership or control limits the ability to use a resource for the common good. It limits the ability to benefit all of humankind. Unlike a commons, even specific data are usually reusable resources. They are not necessarily consumed when they are used. Therefore, there is the potential that knowledge creation and research could continue to make use of personal information in a non-exclusive way that allows multiple parties, or even our communities as a whole, to benefit from the use. But that same personal data can be used indefinitely to harm other individuals over and over. As representatives of the world's data protection authorities, we have a responsibility to lead this conversation. We must come together to decide how far the cannon shot of an individual's claim on personal information can reach. Is it time for a treaty system establishing conventions on data? Can there be a cannon shot rule for data? Perhaps it is appropriate to ask this question here in Bermuda, where you are never far from shores or historic forts. As a global privacy assembly, we should begin thinking through this process of international consensus. Let's start by asking, what do we agree on? How can we ensure that a potential use of personal information is trustworthy and fair? And how can we make sure that technologies serve all humankind? Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I was very confused walking into the room just now. So I'm delighted to welcome you to our second and sadly final full day of the open session of the 45th Global Privacy Assembly. Today we'll start by talking about the issue of risk. Bermuda is a critical global hub of insurance and risk management. And thinking about risk in the privacy context has the potential to become the universal language of this assembly. So to speak further about these issues, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Suzanne Williams-Charles of the Association of Bermuda Insurers and Reinsurers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to those that are streaming in. Good morning to those in the room, and welcome to Bermuda. As Alex mentioned, I'm Suzanne Williams-Charles, and I am the Director of Policy and Regulation for the Association of Bermuda Insurers and Reinsurers, or ABIR. And ABIR is a trade association that represents the policy interests of global reinsurers that are domiciled in Bermuda and operate out of Bermuda, and we represent their policy interests globally. And we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years with Alex, which I'll talk about in my brief comments. So the first panel this morning is going to explore the balance required by data protection authorities and organizations that use data in order to accomplish their respective missions while protecting the rights of individuals. And before the panel moves into the discussions on risk, it's only fitting that you hear a bit about Bermuda, who's also referred to as the world's risk capital. The importance of data privacy to the reinsurance industry will also be discussed, and the importance of a strong framework for data protection to Bermuda's reputation as a leading financial center. So the insurance industry in Bermuda has undergone a remarkable evolution over the past 40 years or so, and more recently in the last 20 years, transforming from a relatively small local market to a global insurance and reinsurance hub. Beginning in the mid-20th century, Bermuda attracted international insurers and reinsurers, leading to the establishment of numerous sophisticated and innovative companies. When speaking of risk in Bermuda, one's mind immediately goes to the reinsurance industry, which as an industry is the largest economic driver for the country. Reinsurance is a risk management tool used by insurance companies to mitigate their own risk, and it involves the transfer of a portion of the risk from an insurance company to a reinsurance company. And this process essentially helps ensure companies protect their financial stability and ensure that they are there to cover large or unexpected claims. So Hurricane Andrew is really the pivotal point for Bermuda, which struck in 1992, and it shaped Bermuda's reinsurance industry essentially. Hurricane Andrew was one of the costliest and most devastating hurricanes in U.S. history, particularly affecting Florida and Louisiana. It resulted in massive insurance losses, especially in property and casualty lines, and the insurance industry faced substantial financial strain due to the extensive damage. In the wake of Hurricane Andrew, insurance companies faced the need for greater protection against catastrophic losses. They sought to transfer some of the risk associated with such events to reinsurers to ensure their financial stability and capacity to underwrite policies. Many insurance and reinsurance companies set up operations in Bermuda to provide catastrophe reinsurance and other specialized coverage. Hurricane Andrew's legacy on Bermuda's reinsurance market is substantial. Bermuda remains a key player in the global catastrophe reinsurance and risk transfer landscape, demonstrating its resilience and adaptability in the face of catastrophic events. Bermuda's insurance sector has thrived due to its adaptability, resilience, and ability to attract top talent and capital, making it a prominent and influential player in the global insurance arena. Bermuda's status as a world-class financial center is a result of a combination of factors that make it an attractive place for international financial business to operate and serve clients worldwide. Bermuda has earned a reputation as a world-class financial center and a prominent international financial hub, primarily due to its stable political environment, sound regulatory policies, and well-established financial services industry. Data privacy is crucial for reinsurance companies because, amongst other things, it is essential for maintaining trust and reputation, protecting confidential information, enabling data sharing and collaboration, and fulfilling ethical responsibilities. Prioritizing data privacy safeguards the interests of both the reinsurance company and its clients while ensuring the industry's integrity and sustainability. As I'm sure many of you know, in 2016, Bermuda passed the Personal Information Protection Act 2016, and in 2020, upon the appointment of the Privacy Commissioner, ABIR determined it critical to ensure we focused on providing a mechanism to support our member companies through their journey to compliance, and also to ensure we provided the Privacy Commissioner here in Bermuda with relevant data regarding the reinsurance sector to facilitate implementation. In 2021, ABIR established the ABIR Data Privacy Task Force, primarily to support the missions and goals of the Privacy Commissioner, and establish a communication link between the Privacy Commissioner and a key stakeholder group. This communication link was critical to ensure that there was a mechanism to provide feedback on the likely impact of the impact of PIPA when applied to the reinsurance sector, and to determine that the well-established data privacy standards such as GDPR were also considered when that framework was implemented. Many of our members have global operations, and the continuity of the implementation of PIPA with the consideration of others standards was very important to our membership. I will now hand the stage and the microphone over to Trevor Hughes and this distinguished panel to discuss data privacy and risk in more depth. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. It is lovely to see such a packed room. There's seats up front. If any of you can't find seats in the back, please do move up. There are some empty seats up here. No, we truly are delighted to be here today to talk about risk, an issue so central to data protection and privacy around the world, an issue that is so prominent as we navigate a new AI present and future. And we have an esteemed panel joining us today to explore that issue. And let me just tell you a little bit about our format today, and then I will introduce our panel. We're going to have introductory statements. We have a number of questions. We're going to have a dialogue briefly about a number of issues that exist as we think about risk and data protection, risk and AI, risk and how we actually navigate and use the tools and the resources necessary to assess, mitigate, manage risk within organizations, within data protection authorities. We do have time for questions throughout. And so if you have a question, I would be happy to recognize you at any of these microphones. So if you do have a question at any point during the session, please do join us. And I can see some of you shifting in your seats already. Let us get started just for a bit. And then we'll be happy to recognize people at the microphones for questions. And okay, without further ado, Let us dive in. I'm going to introduce our panel. From the far end coming towards me, Marta España is the director of the Spanish Data Protection Authority. We are very happy to have her joining. Welcome, Mar. It's great to have you. Next to Mar is Anu Talus, who is the commissioner for the Finnish Data Protection Authority. She is also the chair of the European Data Protection Board. Welcome, Anu. It's great to have you. Emma Martins is the Data Protection Commissioner for Guernsey, another beautiful island in the Atlantic. Welcome, Emma. It's great to have you here. And last but not least is Naomi Lefkowitz, who is the Senior Privacy Policy Advisor in the Information Tech Lab at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S. Department of Commerce. NIST, as we all know and love it. Welcome, Naomi. It's great to have you here. I will mention that Mar will be speaking in Spanish today, so if you would like to get a translator set, by all means, please do. And with that, why don't we start with opening statements? And we'll start immediately to my right with Naomi.
Great, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. So as Trevor mentioned, NIST is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, but people think of us as the National Measurement Laboratory. So we are sort of the measurement laboratory for the United States. And it's always important, especially in this environment, to mention that we are non-regulatory. So we sort of play this role in the middle of, trying to use science for measurement and produce guidance and tools and frameworks based on that research. And Trevor also mentioned that I'm actually sit in the Information Technology Lab. I lead our privacy engineering program. And so our goal in the Information Technology Lab is to, increase the trustworthiness of information technologies, not surprisingly. So when we established the privacy engineering program, we wanted to provide in that space, more frameworks, tools, guidance to help organizations understand how to do privacy risk management, which at the time, many people were still saying you can't do privacy risk management, right? It's just there are the laws, and that's what you do. But we could see that organizations were struggling because laws provide high level even in prescriptive laws, even with requirements, they're somewhat high level, and every organization has to figure out how to implement that in their particular environment. And so that's really where risk management comes in. And so we really didn't have a lot to go on in privacy risk management. So we looked to cybersecurity as a model to try to understand, how did they develop all these technologies and guidance and standards, and how could we do that for privacy? And what we looked at was that, and I heard this question on Monday night, which was, what is privacy risk? Like, how do we do that? And so we had to create a model, because if you ask anyone in security, like, how do you assess risk? They all have a consistent model. They've long agreed that, what's the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability, and the impact if that occurs. And so we thought, well, how do you do that in data processing, right? And as we heard, data processing is being done for, mission and business purposes. And, so is that the threat? Is the organization, what they're doing, the threat? And so what we saw was, how do you figure out when does your operation in data processing, when does that sort of tip over into creating some kind of problem or harm for, individuals or groups or a society? And so that was the basis of the model. So what's the likelihood, we said, of a problematic data action? And what's the impact if that occurs? And all of a sudden, now we have a way to analyze systems. And like the security model, the cybersecurity model, you can put any input into threat, right? There are various kinds of threats, and some of them will be more relevant in certain environments than others. And so we can say you can input any kind of problem into a problematic data action. And so you could do embarrassment, you could do emotional distress, you could do loss of self-determination, you could do discrimination, any problem that is relevant, we can identify those problems, you can put that into the model. And the other main construct that we saw with cybersecurity was that they had sort of system design objectives like confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we wondered if we could come up with a set that was complementary. And so we created predictability, manageability, and disassociability to help engineers think about what are the capabilities that I need in my system. And we've seen those work as well. So with those sort of foundational constructs, we've been able to build upon those and integrate privacy guidance into our cybersecurity guidance documents, our publications, develop the NIST privacy framework. We developed a privacy risk assessment methodology, which is a set of worksheets to actually assess the systems. And we saw the power of that to help organizations communicate the sort of story of privacy risk. So while security is there saying, hey, we've got this vulnerability, it's bad, we've got to adjust it, privacy was sitting there saying, privacy is value that's very important. That's, when it comes to giving out resources, like which story wins? So now we could say, hey, when we do this, we're going to create embarrassment for our customers and they're not going to be happy, or what have you. And now there was a story that could get resources. And we saw the power of that codification. And also, we were giving grants, and so in a sense, we almost sat as regulators, right? Regulators of their money. And we saw that they would come to us and they'd say, well, we used your tool, and here are the risks we identified. And most importantly, risk identification is just the start. Then you get into the conversation about what should we do about that risk. And that's where security really took off in terms of using technologies and policies to help manage those risks. And so, they said, well, here's our risk, and we think that risk doesn't merit this very expensive technology. And, we were like, well, you have a point, right? And so we could have a conversation about what was the best way to address that risk. But at the same time, it's also helping us to spur research into privacy enhancing technologies, which sort of brings us to today. And so we have these frameworks and tools, and now we're really trying to move into evaluation metrics for privacy enhancing technologies and increase their adoption. And so those are the various efforts that we are taking at NIST today.
Fantastic. So lots more to get into there, but let's get through our introductory statements. Emma, please introduce yourself.
Emma Martins, Data Protection Commissioner, Guernsey. And firstly, I want to say thank you to Alex and the team for such a warm welcome. To see where you've come from and where you are now, Alex, makes us all in this community very proud. So well done to you and the team. As a regulator for a small jurisdiction, just to be clear, we have our own legislation, but we are essentially considered adequate for the purpose of the GDPR. So we're very closely aligned geographically, as well as from a legal perspective, to the standards there. And risk is something that exercises data protection regulators a lot, and always has done, and rightly so. And I would like to say, I think language is really important here as well. I think we need to talk about risk in the context of harms and vulnerabilities and explore all of those things. Risk is not just one thing. And data protection is always very familiar with all of those things. It's a language that we're all very familiar with, and lots of those elements are deeply embedded in the legislation itself. I mean, our legislation in Guernsey is very similar to GDPR, so I speak in that context. We've got the protection of rights, really fundamental here, and the risks when those rights aren't upheld or aren't respected. You've got controllers' responsibilities. Embedded is the accountability. And that gets to the heart of risk assessments, I think, and vulnerability assessments. DPIAs, the requirement around DPIAs for controllers, the requirements around high-risk processing, particularly. Data protection officers, you need to think about all of these things when you're recruiting and whether you need one or not. And importantly, in the assessment of breaches by the controller, they need to work out what the impact of those breaches is or may be in the future. And of course, the law specifically talks about those groups of people and the characteristics that the law considers to be of greater risk, particularly children, in GDPR and our own legislation. And it also gives us special category data, which I know we'll all be familiar with that term. So the law is essentially saying this type of information, these type of people are riskier if you're handling that. And then from the regulator's perspective, we've got breach and complaint handling, how we look at those. I'll come on to talk about that again a little bit later, I hope. And in the consideration of sanctions, we need to be considering these things carefully. And of course, there is a statutory duty around making sure that children are protected. And I do want, just to finish this comment here, is to say that when we talk about risk assessments, and we've heard the complexity of it from just now from Naomi, but we talk about risk assessments, we talk about risk-based approaches, and it sounds so straightforward. It sounds something that's so easy to deliver. And I know we'll go on to explore some of these questions, but actually, I think in the context of today's world, the fourth industrial revolution, that we're immersed in data, I think we need to reconceptualize what we mean by it. I think we need to rethink how we respond to it.
Fascinating, fascinating. So lots to discuss, for sure. Commissioner Talus, please.
Well, thank you, and good morning, and thank you for the invitation for this panel. Just to start shortly with the introduction, I was elected for the EDPB chair this May, so some months ago, but I am also the Finnish Information Commissioner. I've held that post for some years now, but I'm not new to data protection. This is actually something I've done quite a long time. I, for example, did the GDPR negotiations for the Finnish government. So I have a long background in the data protection. And then going to the topic of today, we are talking about risk. And of course, now I already mentioned the GDPR negotiations. So one of the underlying features of the GDPR was that it's a risk-based approach, and this is, I think, very much what we will discuss here today. So the GDPR builds on a risk-based approach, and now we very often face the question of what does this actually mean? What does the risk-based approach actually mean? Because we cannot assess how to protect fundamental rights. And this part is, of course, correct. The fundamental rights are not modulated. They are not negotiable. But then there are the second part, which is how you apply the technical solutions to protect the fundamental rights. And this is where we need to find the balance. And this is in the core of the risk-based approach. What we do as EDBB to promote also this approach is that we, for example, provide guidance for the companies to enable the companies to assess their risks in accordance with the aims the data processing involves. So this is one of the examples, but I think that we can then get in more detail to these questions a little bit later.
Absolutely. So definitely much to discuss about the tension, the balance, the relationship between fundamental rights and risk-based approaches. I think there is quite a lot there, and we will get into that. Last but not least, for introductions, Commissioner Marta España.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
And welcome and good morning to everybody. I'm sorry, but I will change to Spanish. It's the second most spoken language in the world, and I will thank the translator for their help. So if you don't have the headphones, it's time to go for that. Yo soy responsable de la Agencia Española de Protección de Datos desde hace más de 8 años y Uno de los ejes transversales en los que he intentado, ¿no?, transmitir a lo largo de estos 8 años ha sido que esa proactividad que el Reglamento General de Protección de Datos obliga a los responsables públicos y privados, deberíamos ajustarlo también en el ámbito de los reguladores. Y desde hace años estamos trabajando en temas tan importantes como la responsabilidad social de la Agencia Española de Protección de Datos para ayudar, facilitar y acompañar a los responsables públicos y privados en este análisis de riesgos. Hace 8 años creé la División de Innovación Tecnológica, el responsable está aquí, Luis de Salvador, y hemos puesto a disposición de los responsables y encargados unas herramientas muy potentes que han supuesto el beneficio de más de 100.000 personas. Desde Facilita, otra herramienta que hay específica de análisis de riesgo, y otra sobre evaluación de impacto, donde hemos identificado más de 173 riesgos. Eso no quiere decir que estén todos, pero por lo menos es una buena base sobre la que empezar a evaluar. Y ha supuesto una gran ayuda. Estas herramientas están traducidas al inglés y disponibles de forma gratuita para cualquier autoridad que forme parte de la conferencia internacional. Y quiero hacer también hincapié en que hablar de riesgos no es hablar solo de seguridad. Un riesgo puede ser para una empresa de Internet el no utilizar una base jurídica adecuada en el marco del artículo 6 del Reglamento General de Protección de Datos, por ejemplo. Y como es una intervención breve, quiero destacar 2 temas especiales que a mí me preocupan especialmente y donde creo que como humanidad, como planeta, en un mundo global, en un mundo digital, nos estamos jugando muchísimo. Uno es el acceso por parte de los menores a las nuevas tecnologías, a Internet. En nuestro país los datos son preocupantes y creo que en Estados Unidos y en otros países también. Los menores están accediendo a contenidos inadecuados desde que se les regala el primer móvil, con 8, 9, 10 años, y en muchas ocasiones eso implica el acceso inmediato a la pornografía, a contenidos violentos, en una etapa que es clave en su desarrollo cerebral y en el desarrollo de la empatía. Los servicios de salud están preocupados por los daños que esto está provocando en la salud mental. Soy consciente que en Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, se han interpuesto algunas demandas contra las redes sociales por los daños que está provocando en la salud mental a los menores. Y yo siempre transmito que pagar con datos es pagar. Y se están monetizando datos sensibles, datos especialmente protegidos de los menores e influyendo en sus comportamientos sin que las autoridades estemos pudiendo ser lo suficientemente proactivas para poder proteger ese acceso a contenidos inadecuados a los menores a edades tempranas. Los delitos sexuales violentos están aumentando y creo que es algo que debería estar dentro de nuestro propio análisis de riesgo como autoridades reguladoras, dentro de las prioridades en nuestro ámbito de actuación. Tengo algunos datos que son preocupantes. El Centro de Investigación Económica Regna Fritz de Estados Unidos ha publicado un estudio reciente. El coeficiente intelectual de la gente joven está bajando entre 2,5 y 4 puntos cada 10 años, así como el índice de lectoescritura. Y esto es algo que debemos hacer entre familia, industria y reguladores para prevenir, detectar y tratar cuando se están produciendo estos accesos inadecuados. Estamos trabajando en la Agencia Española en criterios para verificación de la edad, para precisamente garantizando la privacidad de los adultos, poder dar ese certificado, ese atributo de que eres mayor de edad, pero poder blindar que menores no accedan a contenidos que no serían apropiados para el desarrollo de su personalidad. Y el segundo punto, y ya voy a ser muy breve, Trevor, es todo el tema de los neurodatos y la neurotecnología. Va a intervenir a lo largo de esta semana Rafael Yuste, que es una eminencia, es la persona encargada por Obama para dirigir el proyecto BRAIN. Y ahora mismo a nivel científico, los científicos ya pueden leer todas nuestras conexiones conscientes, las inconscientes también, y modificar nuestras conexiones neuronales. Esto implica que a nivel científico ya se puede influir en lo que pensamos, lo que sentimos, lo que decidimos y cómo nos comportamos. Esto en manos de la ciencia tiene unas posibilidades tremendas de desarrollo para el tratamiento de tetraplegia, problemas de trauma, etcétera, pero en manos de determinadas compañías o gobiernos totalitarios, nunca hasta ahora la humanidad ha tenido un riesgo tan alto y tan grave como el que tenemos ahora. Y Rafael, a través de la Fundación NeuroRights, está promoviendo que en la Declaración de los Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas se consagren los nuevos neuroderechos. No hay derecho más importante que el derecho a la privacidad mental. el derecho a la identidad mental, el derecho a que nadie pueda influir en lo que sentimos y lo que decidimos. Y lo quiero apuntar también porque creo que esto debería ser también un tema prioritario para todas las autoridades que formamos parte de la conferencia internacional. Gracias.
Commissioner, thank you. Gracias. Gosh, what a broad array of issues that we've highlighted. I've been taking some notes. I'm just going to run through them quickly. Naomi got us started with a description of the NIST process and developing a framework for assessing risk, and how ideas like embarrassment, which I want to dive into a bit because it's such an inchoate or ephemeral topic. How do you measure risk or harm in an area like embarrassment? We talked about the importance of harm and the recognition of vulnerability. Commissioner España just raised issues of children and their particular vulnerability and whether that raises higher risk. Certainly it does. It wasn't mentioned, but I also want to put on the table the idea of both individual and societal risks. What are we measuring for? Is it just an individual assessment, or do we have broader interests at stake? We also have questions of who decides? Who holds the measuring stick that determines risk? Is it the organization? Is it the individual, the data subject? Is it the regulator? I think there are important questions for us to understand there. And I also particularly liked Commissioner Talus telling us that fundamental rights are not negotiable, but the next word that she said was, but. And I think it suggests that there does need to be an assessment of risk in a world of limited resources, where the digital economy is so prevalent and so many issues are presented all at once. I think there is a question for us to tackle there, which is how do we allocate our limited resources in the best way to the best effect? So we have our work cut out for us in the next 35 or so minutes. I'm actually going to start with Commissioner Talus. Can you help us understand risk management and mitigation within GDPR? How does it interact with a parallel focus of fundamental rights? How does the recognition of fundamental human rights being non-negotiable exist at the same time as a risk management approach? Is there not a friction between those two things? And can they live simultaneously within one piece of legislation or regulation like the GDPR?
Well, I do think that they can live side by side. Well, to repeat that, I do also think that the fundamental rights, they are non-negotiable. But then we have the technical and organizational structures where we have the possibility to decide and choose from different options. So there is where we have the risk-based approach, and this is where we can implement the risk-based approach. Not every processing of personal data contain similar risks, and this is where the balancing must take place when deciding on the technical and organizational measures to take to mitigate the risk. And what we do in TDBB, we provide guidance to help assessing these risks. And what we also do is that we, for example, have certain targeted enforcement actions, coordinated enforcement actions based also on the assessment of how risky the processing is. For example, 2 years ago, we had the coordinated enforcement action focused on the use of cloud in the public sector. So this is one way we can also take the risk-based approach into account in our work.
Excellent. So let's go then, I guess to reframe that or just to capture this idea, fundamental human rights are fundamental human rights, and they are non-negotiable. However, the amount of risk that a particular activity may raise will determine the appropriate response, the appropriate tool, the appropriate mechanism to manage that risk. It doesn't change the fact that a fundamental human right sits at the base of that assessment. There are non-legislative, non-fundamental human rights risks, however. Naomi mentioned one, which is embarrassment. And embarrassment is probably not legislated in many places, in many ways. I'm sure it has formulations in some laws around the world, but there are also risks to organizations that are non-legislative. And the NIST framework, it would seem to me, would incorporate or accommodate the inclusion of legislative regulatory compliance risks, but also be more expansive than that as well. Naomi, can you explain a little bit about that work at NIST and why such tools are important for organizations? Why do they need that systematized risk management approach as they are tackling data issues and privacy issues?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. So, and again, I think it's important to understand as you know, another way to say non-legislative is that these are voluntary tools, and I think it's important to understand the NIST approach to that, which is, you know, we think that they need to be used by we would like them to be used by as wide a range of organizations as possible in all sectors. And in order to do that, and because they're voluntary, they have to be helpful. Otherwise, no one's going to use them. So we run these very open, public, transparent processes where we try to gather as much input as possible through various modes, from workshops to public comments on documents, before we come out with it's not even a final version, right? We consider these living documents that we update from time to time. And so just to sort of understand that background is important because, you know, we recognize how important it is to address flexibility. So, you know, agree that, you know, we have these, you know, basic fundamental rights or civil liberties, as you might call them in the US, but you know, how do you implement that, and how do you adjust that? I mean, you know, when you walk outside your door, right, you are negotiating privacy, right? So we are always negotiating privacy in our lives between individual rights and sort of societal needs. And so this is where, you know, risk management can really help, and having a framework that provides that sort of consistency. And we've seen this now with organizations who've said, you know, large multinational organizations who say, we use the privacy framework because it helps us build sort of a foundational program that we can then tailor to different jurisdictions. And we've also seen very small or you know, organizations with not very mature privacy programs say, well, we use it as a starting point to help us organize and think about the things that, you know, we need to have in our program. So there, and then the final point is that everyone also really likes it as a communication tool because you know, both inside the organization, right? Because privacy risk management is something that has to, it's not just for the privacy program, the IT program, senior executives, everyone has to be involved in privacy risk management. And then you can use it as a communication tool with, you know, your service providers you know, or other organizations to sort of have that communication. This is our priorities. You know, are you going to be able to help us meet our priorities? Or here's how we can help you meet your priorities, right? So it can be used by organizations with different roles in the ecosystem. And, you know, again, potentially it can be used even with regulators to say, this is how we organized our program. These are the measures that we are taking to meet the requirements of the law or the regulation. So those are some of the sort of very key points about the frameworks and how they work.
Excellent. Let's shift to what risk frameworks might miss. And I'm going to ask Marta España to respond to this. She mentioned appropriately, I think, the risks to children and the risk to mental health, and how when social media was first introduced, much of our conversation was about privacy and data protection issues. We did not understand or perhaps even foresee the risks to mental health for particularly young girls associated with the use of social media. Let's use a historical context. When automobiles were first introduced, they really were understood to present safety risks, transport safety risks. And so there were speed limits and brakes and other things that were introduced. It wasn't for almost 100 years that the environmental concerns associated with the use of internal combustion engines and exhaust and the associated health issues and environmental issues were really understood. How do we accommodate for what risk-based frameworks cannot see? How do we know that we are capturing risks appropriately and leaving flexibility in these systems for future risks that cannot be understood or seen today? Commissioner.
Muchas gracias. Creo que es una muy buena pregunta y que para poder hacer una buena análisis y evaluación de riesgos es fundamental aplicar dos principios básicos del Reglamento General de Protección de Datos, que es privacidad por defecto y desde el diseño. Ese análisis de riesgo tiene que hacerse antes de empezar a realizar ese tratamiento de datos. Algo tan sencillo como comentabas, Trevor, si una red social realiza un buen análisis de riesgo y una verificación adecuada de la edad, vamos a evitar muchos problemas, por ejemplo, a posteriori, ¿no? Y voy a poner ejemplos que todos vais a entender de la vida diaria. Ninguno montaríamos un negocio sin haber hecho un análisis de riesgos de cuáles son nuestras bases financieras, los posibles ingresos, etcétera. O si decides tener un hijo con una pareja y no haces un análisis de riesgos, muchas veces puedes tener unas consecuencias que luego acarreas, ¿no?, durante toda tu vida. Estamos haciendo análisis de riesgo a diario en nuestra vida personal, en nuestra vida profesional y en nuestra vida como organización. Y este análisis de riesgos no es un análisis estático, que se hace al principio y ahí nos quedamos. No, es imposible. Es un análisis que tiene que ser repetitivo, continuo, periódico y tiene que tener, es como un junco, como un bambú, tiene que tener flexibilidad y debe realizarse de manera periódica que implique una mirada transversal con medidas organizativas, medidas técnicas, medidas de seguridad, que salten alertas si cambia la legislación, si hay nuevas amenazas, una posible quiebra de seguridad o ha cambiado la propia estructura de la organización, entonces hay que volver a revisar. Tiene que ser algo con la suficiente fortaleza, pero al mismo tiempo con la suficiente flexibilidad para poder adaptarse a un mundo en el que ya estamos viendo con la inteligencia artificial generativa, con los neurodatos, está creciendo a un ritmo mucho más rápido del que quizás todos podamos asumir y por eso este análisis de riesgo debe ser continuo y periódico.
It's excellent. So many great points there to capture. One particularly is that a risk assessment is not a point-in-time assessment. Rather, it is an ongoing tool that you need to revisit often. Now, one might then ask, well, how often is enough? When do you revisit? What is the cadence of your risk assessment and for what practices? And in some ways, that's associated with the risk as well, isn't it? The higher the risk, one might imagine, the more often that you might want to be visiting and performing risk assessments. Let's now shift to the Data Protection Authority environment because DPAs as well manage risk, they assess risk, they prioritize their activities. DPAs are notoriously understaffed and underfunded, under-resourced, and have to allocate their scarce resources in ways that have the most effect, but also respond to the greatest risk. So Emma, perhaps you can help us understand, for a small office like yours, how does that happen? What does risk assessment look like for a data protection authority when you're assessing all of the various things that you're responsible for?
Well, as an office that really started from scratch in 2018, the first question that we have to ask ourselves is how do you allocate resources? Exactly what you just said. You're sitting with a blank sheet of paper and saying, do you have an entire team of investigators that are responding to complaints? Do you have an entire team of comms? Or what's the balance look like? That's the very first, it sounds obvious, but it's an important question for all regulators, regardless of size. And we're a tiny office, but we have the same questions to answer. And I really want to just emphasize that we always think about risk in terms of harms and vulnerabilities as well. So this is sort of wrapped up in the language that we use. So the allocation of resources and how we want to manage the staff and what sort of people we want to have on the ground as well. And then sort of more practical, more operational, how we assess breaches, how we handle complaints. And I think there was a point yesterday from the Canadian Commissioner about how we can use breaches and complaints to give out positive and constructive messages around learning. We try and do that a lot because it's all very well, I mean, sanctions and public statements are there to punish, but they're also there, they should also be there to show other people what not to do. So trying to be really clear about some of the things that have gone wrong, and maybe there's some of the things that controllers can do to prevent them from going wrong. Proactive inquiries is open to regulators as well when they see a particular area where they're concerned about. And I want to mention a story that I think was only in the paper today that highlights one of the risks that we need to be mindful of is the risk that trust is lost in the system more broadly. There was a story today where in the UK, I think it's called the UK Biobank, where thousands of people have opted in, have consented to giving their samples to this bank for medical research, but it's been stalled because of privacy concerns. Now, the optics of that, I don't know the details, forgive me, but the optics of that just, again, puts data protection and privacy people in the naughty corner with the general public. So this loss of trust is really important, I think, for us to understand. And I do want to make an important point here in terms of the list of things that we think of in the office, is that we mustn't forget that we are part of the risk picture as a regulator, okay? So ineffective regulation, poorly managed regulation, regulatory capture, lack of independence, all of those things make us a risk. Okay, so we need to make sure that we're humble enough to understand and see that and have an answer for it. So, you know, we're alive to these things, we're thoughtful about these things, but I think we need to be careful, and it's something I said in my intro comments, because, you know, operationally, a lot of these assessment of risks sits with the controller. You mentioned it before, Trevor, that, you know, who is best placed to be assessing these things? Well, sometimes regulators will think maybe it's not the controller. So the question then is who and how do you resource that? But I also think, you know, going back to a point that Ma made about children, it's really important, and we have a statutory duty around children. But I do think vulnerability to risk goes way beyond age. It goes way beyond whether it's special category data or not. So that's what I mean about the sort of broadening our horizon and how we approach risk. It's complex, it's multifaceted in a way that today I think it wasn't 10 years ago. And I want to just, if I may, just give one example. Those UK-ish based will be aware of the police service at Northern Ireland breach. I don't know if those of you are familiar with that, a few months ago now. So the entire HR database of police officers in the police service was disclosed, for want of a better word. It was heavily reported in the media in the UK. Now, if you'd asked serving police officers the day before that breach, serving police officers in Northern Ireland, and those of you that know the politics of that place will know the complexities of life in that part of the world. If you'd asked a serving police officer, what is your biggest risk tomorrow morning? They probably would have answered, well, I checked for it under my car. They would not have answered my HR department. So again, we need to stop sometimes and think, well, what does risk actually look like? And what are we doing about it? Because the under the car is, in a sense, the easy risk to look for. The disclosure of HR data from your own employer, which potentially puts your life at risk for the rest of your life. Right. It should make us stop and think. And if I may want to continue the analogy that Alex has started with the water, I have to be honest, I sometimes feel that as regulators, that we're working really hard to help people shore up their flood-damaged properties, to scoop out flood waters, shift sandbags to try and prevent the water from coming back. And we can do that really well. We can do that with real integrity. We really want to help them. But it's the leaking dam up the road that's the problem. And that's what we need to be looking at. So it's not that the individual homeowners don't deserve our attention, don't deserve our care. They do, but just unless and until we fix the dam, we're just going to have to keep throwing resources. So looping back to your point about resources, we can just keep tooling up regulators. Or we can take a moment to say, well, what does it actually look like to make meaningful outcomes in this? And can you think of any other regulatory arena where we are so preoccupied with post-event harms and post-event damage. There was a quote, forgive me, I can't remember who said it, some great speakers yesterday, but that the innovation doesn't wait. Well, I beg to differ, because if you think about medicines and drugs, aviation, those of us on the plane the other night, we were delayed, and it was really annoying, but if you said to me, there's a bit on that plane, you're about to fly over the Atlantic for 7 hours, there's a bit on that plane that's not quite right. You all right with that? I'd have said no, thanks. So I'm happy with a delay, right? So innovation does wait and can wait. The question is who is asking it to wait, and if we're not asking it to wait, should we? So we need to engage with harm and risks, I think, a little bit differently. I'm good at engaging with a plane harm, right, or a drugs harm. Yeah. We're not so good at dealing with ephemeral risks and harms, I think, and the data is seen as ephemeral. And we've talked about, you mentioned it before, about mental health of children and young people. Can you imagine if those harms were physical? How would we react? And I would suggest that we would react differently. Why? Because we need to be able to answer, well, if we react differently for that, but the impact is as great in this context, why aren't we doing more?
Fascinating. So many great things to dive into there. I think the distinction of cause v. symptom is certainly relevant. The idea of privacy, data protection harms often being inchoate, ephemeral, difficult to assess and quantify. I think that's one of the great challenges in our field, is that it is not easy to always see the harm, either in a quantifiable monetary amount or a demonstrable sort of recognition of harm. It's not like a physical injury often in our space. We deal with harms of dignity and pride and integrity of your data and embarrassment and other things that have a tendency to be a bit more challenging to assess and manage. Let's focus on something, and Emma, you've just raised this. Anu, I'm going to ask you this question. As we are doing risk assessments, when do we say that a risk is too high? Emma mentioned that there was a statement previously that innovation doesn't wait, and yet there are circumstances in other industries, other fields, aviation, consumer products, pharmaceuticals, where a consumer safety, a product safety approach would say that, no, something doesn't go to market unless it can actually be proven to be safe and beneficial for those in the market. It would seem that in data protection, we have a slightly different approach, which is that largely within the boundaries of legislation, things are permissible, and we assess risk on an ongoing basis. When do we say it's too much? When has it gone over a line that is too far, and we say, no, this must be stopped?
This was for me. Okay, thank you. I think this is a good bridge to AI. And we have actually addressed this topic within the EDBB. We issued a joint opinion with the EDPS on the Commission's proposal on the AI Act. And here we did highlighted some situations where we actually do think that the risk would be too high. For example, we did underline in our opinion that there should be a ban on the use of remote biometric identification in publicly accessible areas. So this is where we saw that the risk would be so high that it should not be allowed. So this, I think, would provide one example where we are reaching that type of risk that it would be very difficult to mitigate that with different.
So a great example in the EU AI Act, currently under negotiation, and it's understood to be in the trilogue process, one of the issues that is contested, not entirely having full agreement yet, is an idea of a ban on biometric identification systems, particularly facial recognition systems. So there's one where we say that technology has societal consequences that are too high. Naomi, help us understand in the NIST framework or just generally, How do you quantify and assess some of these inchoate harms? What is the measuring stick for this? What does it look like in the NIST framework? How should practitioners out there that are doing risk assessments and trying to mitigate, how should they be measuring these harms when often they are very challenging to assess?
Yeah, so that's why we developed the privacy risk assessment methodology. So we use what is in NIST parlance a semi-quantitative approach where you can score. So first you sort of assess and map the system and sort of try to understand what are some of the issues that the different operations that you're taking with data are creating. And so you might say, well, people didn't anticipate that this information would be revealed. And so some of them might find that embarrassing. And so you would sort of score that and say, what's the likelihood that, our population of, that will be using the service might feel embarrassed about some of this information. And you can just, bucket it. We use a 1 to 10 score, which is, it's not a external sort of 2 + 2 = 4. It's something that organizations just do internally and sort of try to figure out. We've had some organizations, very interestingly, have different roles you do the scoring. So like a lawyer, a privacy program, and like an IT person or something, and then see like if they're really have a discussion where the scores might vary a lot, and that engenders a conversation in the organization, and so then you just come out with this score, and then you have the impact side, right? Because a risk model is likelihood times impact. And so, then you say, well, what's the impact if we create this embarrassment? And, that's the harder one, right? Because, people experience embarrassment very differently, right? Like some people are just like, that's not great, but whatever. Other people don't want to leave their apartment and face their neighbors, right? So we have sort of, you can certainly try, and you can use research, right? And as we increase our research capabilities, that's something that organizations should look to be like, how do we think people will react? But we also have sort of proxies of, organizational impacts. Like if we did embarrass people, like what would that do to our reputation? Or will people not want to use our products? Or, will we have non-compliance costs? Or internal culture costs, right? Like we've seen in the US, like employee walkouts, right? So you can use that and you can score that too. And ultimately, we have different manifestations, but many people use our heat map. So you can see like, whoa, these risks are going into the red, and these are yellow, and these are green. And so you help prioritize, because as you said, I've yet to meet an organization that has unlimited resources. So these are the ways that you can actually sort of make it more substantive. And the one final point I would make on this is, you were sort of saying like, how, like we have these other areas where we, test things and it's not impossible to do that. It's never going to be perhaps as precise as, here's what we know about dumping pollution into a river and how many parts it's going to take before fish die, right? But we do have the ability, and this is why we put into the privacy framework in our sort of communicate function, more feedback mechanisms, more reliance on research, right? Every company I know does a lot of focus groups and product, on how their products are going to be used and received. Why not put into that some privacy focusing group? How will our people receive this from a privacy perspective? And so we will never be perfect, unless you're just not going to do the thing. Then you can't avoid all risk, but you could try to mitigate it down to a acceptable level. And this is, as a former regulator at the Federal Trade Commission, I've now come to realize that regulators are in some ways arbiters of acceptable levels of risk, right? And so they will sort of decide like what is the acceptable residual level of risk.
Interesting. So I want to capture a few things that Naomi said here because I think they're helpful. Many organizations will use a risk register structure. They'll use tools that will help them assess risk. You assess the likelihood of risk. You assess the impact of risk. You assess the effectiveness of the mitigations that you might put in place, and that gives you a residual risk. There are residual risks that you have to accept because there's no other answer. There are residual risks that you can stack rank and assess resources against in order to manage and mitigate beyond that. I do want to just dive in and not let you off the hook, Naomi, on how challenging it is to assess the impact of some of these circumstances. When we are looking at risk, particularly in privacy and data protection, you're absolutely right to mention that we often talk about individuals because different individuals may have different understandings or perceptions of their own levels of embarrassment or harm that might occur. But it is also contextual. Different individuals will have different contexts of risk in a workplace, at home, on the street. It is also culturally normative. Different cultures and countries around the world, different cultures within countries can have different normative expectations of what is harm or what is problematic when it comes to use of their data, violation of privacy or data protection. All of that creates this enormously complex risk environment to assess impacts. And so I will let you off the hook. I won't make you answer that, but I think, okay, please do. So how do you navigate that complexity? What does that look like? Because it seems to me that is the most complex matrix of risks that one might imagine.
Yeah, well, I remember once, somebody I went to a dinner and it was like the head of privacy for Microsoft, and he said, risk management requires creativity and intelligence. And so the quality of the people that you have, the workforce, is critical, right? So, you talk about individuals, but the framework, our risk assessment can be used at individual level, at the group level, at the societal level, because now we have, maybe we didn't think hard enough or try to understand the risks initially to children, for example, but now we do. And so as we've been hearing, risk assessment is not static. So now this information should be folded in to the products that are being developed. And it shouldn't be acceptable to say, oh, I didn't know that this would harm children because now we have this research, and that should be part of the ongoing changes to existing products as well as inputs into the development of future products and services.
Excellent. Well done. Good answer, by the way. I'm going to come back to a point that you made, but let me turn to Mar. And Anu raised AI, and of course, I feel like when we're talking about risk, at this moment in time, we have to mention AI and the risks associated with AI that are emerging. Interestingly, when we look at the EU AI Act, when we look at laws around the world, there is a very clear legislative direction, a policy direction that risk management approaches are the right policy tools currently for addressing AI. Certainly, data protection, discrimination, and other well-formed areas of law intersect and interact with AI policy significantly. But with AI legislation as it exists in the EU AI Act, in C27 in Canada, and many of the frameworks around the world, risk management appears to be the favored mechanism to manage AI. Tell us about that. Is that right, or are there fundamental rights implications that we should be capturing? And what about those unknown risks that you so rightly raised for us, Mara, before? How are we to know that we aren't approving or allowing technologies to roll into the marketplace, particularly with AI, that may have very severe consequences for us ultimately?
Es una pregunta crucial. Vivimos en un momento crítico con la irrupción de las nuevas tecnologías, sobre todo con la inteligencia artificial generativa, y yo siempre planteo La privacidad en muchas ocasiones para las organizaciones es como la salud para las personas. No la valoramos hasta que la perdemos. Y cuando ya se pierde, hay una brecha de seguridad o hay un problema, es cuando el CEO de la organización se echa las manos a la cabeza. La inteligencia artificial puede ser una gran herramienta a la hora de evaluar y mitigar los riesgos, pero siempre tiene que ir complementada por un buen equipo dentro de la organización que conozca, que complemente esa estructura de la organización, ese funcionamiento interno. Hay muchas cosas que se palpan a nivel sensitivo, que eso no nos lo va a poder dar nunca la inteligencia artificial, y esa sensibilización, ese conocer dónde puede haber el área de la empresa, ¿no?, más vulnerable, eso es algo que va a tener que tener siempre un complemento humano. Y igual que las personas, hay diferentes personas y diferentes apetitos de riesgo. Hay personas muy conservadoras que invierten sus ahorros a plazo fijo, hay otras que están dispuestas a perderlo todo con tal de tener mayores ganancias. Sí, yo creo que en el ámbito de las autoridades de protección de datos, los organismos reguladores, debemos tener un apetito de riesgo bajo y lanzar esa seguridad y esas herramientas de confianza al mercado. Y eso implica, desde luego, una mirada transversal, eso implica la flexibilidad de poder utilizar la inteligencia artificial, pero siempre con el complemento humano, porque si no, un riesgo ya, de hecho, es si solo el análisis de riesgo se basa en una inteligencia artificial. Ahí ya va a haber un fallo, porque seguro que hay temas muy sutiles, muy profundos, donde la inteligencia artificial, que aprende a base de errores también, no ha podido llegar, ¿no? Entonces, sí a utilizarlo, pero siempre con ese complemento humano y siempre teniendo en cuenta que tenemos que hacer ese análisis de riesgo valorando también el impacto en las minorías, en las personas que pueden tener un mayor riesgo precisamente pues, por un análisis de riesgo defectuoso.
Excellent. I think your points are well taken, Mara, particularly the idea that we also need to recognize that there are communities, populations, which are more vulnerable, and they deserve particular protections as well. We have come to the end of our time. I want to highlight just a few things as we wrap up our panel. First, that it is very clear that risk management is not a point-in-time solution. It is not a mechanism that you can execute once, you can do once, and then it's done, and you put it on a shelf. No, rather, you need highly qualified people that are doing ongoing work and managing risk for an organization, for a data protection authority over time. When you are assessing risk, matters. Before implementation, during implementation, after a risk event has occurred. All of those are important times to be assessing risk. The occurrence of risk absolutely is a factor, the likelihood that a risk may occur, but the effect of risk or the consequences of a risk and consequences to whom actually can have an enormous effect on the decisions that you take from a risk management approach. And ultimately, I want to come back to something that Naomi said, because from where I sit, I think it's one of the most important points, and that is the quality of the people. We need people who do this work. We need people who do this work inside regulatory authorities. DPAs need qualified people. They are understaffed and under-resourced, and they need great people to do incredibly important work. Organizations need qualified people to do the work of this risk management so that these approaches can be effective. And I think this panel has shown us something, and that is that the quality of people here on the stage is a great example of what we can aspire to when we think of effective risk management approaches in the marketplace today in our digital economy. So please join me in thanking these experts. Thank you.
And let me also say thank you very much to everyone, our wonderful panelists. Our next item on our agenda is a coffee and networking break, which you can find downstairs, along with the translation packs if you do need a translation pack. So thank you very much again, speakers. I wanted to take a moment and preview the rest of our day. When we resume at 10 a.m., we will have a panel on Indigenous perspectives in privacy, followed by the award ceremony for the Giovanni Buttarelli Award. And then after lunch, we will discuss data transfer mechanisms and have a call to action, followed by a 3:45 discussion on international cooperation hosted by the European Commission, and an exclusive side event on AI and society brought to us by Meta at 5:30. Thank you very much.
I'm Luisa Yarovsky. I'm a lawyer, PhD researcher, the author of the Privacy Whisperer newsletter, and the founder of Implement Privacy, where we offer privacy training worldwide. Today, I'd like to talk a bit about dark patterns in privacy and how to identify them. So the topic of dark patterns in general has been discussed since around 2010. But the topic of dark patterns in privacy is much more recent in the sense that the first major reports from data protection authorities and also consumer protection authorities were around 2018. And then 2022 and 2023, there were various reports, cases, fines. So it became a much more popular topic. So what are dark patterns in privacy? These are user experience interface techniques. So they happen in the UX interface that try to manipulate the data subject to share more or more sensitive data. So let's give some examples. If you have, let's say, a cookie banner, and there is a very big button written accept all, and no button written reject all, only a low contrast link where you can read more options. If it's not the focus of the user and you offer a pop-up that makes this big green button that is trying to push the user into accepting all cookies, you're not even giving the chance for the user to notice that there is a choice, there is transparency, you can interact with this banner and choose not to accept cookies, for example. You don't even give the button. So this would be an example. Or if when you're asking the user consent and then you use the ambiguous language or double negatives, anything that might confuse the user, this would be also another example of dark pattern. Or when you have a privacy settings menu that is very complicated. So offering no choice is bad, but offering too many choices, let's say dozens of choices, is too much, and the user will not have time, interest, or even the user will not make the effort to interact with all those choices. And the end result will be that the privacy will not be protected, and there will be no meaningful choice. In 2021, I wrote an article talking about dark patterns in personal data collection, and I developed a taxonomy, so to map all those types of dark patterns that happen in the context of privacy. And as we saw now with the examples, they're in a spectrum. So there's not only one type, and what's in common between all of them is the manipulation of the cognitive biases. Very important topic, and the general idea that the UX interface can have compliance implications. So today companies should be much more aware of how they design their interfaces, their privacy settings, their privacy buttons, privacy menus, and all the communication with the user, because there might be a fine due to the way you're designing your interface or your interactions with the user. If you're not being transparent enough, if you're not offering the choice in a way that will help the user navigate these privacy issues. From the point of view of companies, they should know that design matters, so they should train their employees, product people, engineers, designers, marketing, about dark patterns in privacy and how they can affect users, how they can manipulate cognitive biases. Sometimes, even if the company is not being malicious, it can happen. And from the point of view of users, all of us, it's also important to learn the types of cognitive biases that can be affected, how companies try to trick us into sharing more or more sensitive data. So there's a lot of material at the Privacy Whisperer, my newsletter. You can read more there about dark patterns in privacy. Also various academic research articles you can find online on dark patterns as well. And information and awareness, of course, super important. But I think the responsibility is of companies. So companies should be really aware and trying to be proactive, trying to prevent dark patterns in privacy before they happen. So companies, they have the responsibility of protecting users. That's it. I hope this was an interesting lightning talk. And thank you so much for the organizers of the Global Privacy Assembly. Bye.
Good day. I am Patricia McCarter, Administrative Support Officer for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner for Bermuda. Our next panel is Indigenous Perspectives on Privacy and will be moderated by Mr. Michael McEvoy. The panel will examine different perspectives on privacy and data protection. Without further ado, Mr. McEvoy, please begin when you are ready.
Well, good morning, and as my colleague Trevor said in the last session, there's a little bit of room up front. If you're crowded back there, please feel free to come to the front. My name is Michael McEvoy. I'm the Information and Privacy Commissioner for British Columbia in Canada. We are also serve our office as the Secretariat for the Asia Pacific Privacy Authorities on a global stage. I should begin by saying that my great-grandparents and grandparents emigrated to Canada from the Ukraine and in Ireland in the late 1800s and the 1920s, all of which is to say that my roots in what is now called Canada are very recent, and I am not an Indigenous person. I say that out loud because in being asked to do this panel by Alex, I approach it, as I think all of us do, with some degree of humility. It's a very important topic for those of us with Indigenous people within our jurisdictions, and as well as posing legal and moral challenges as well. To help in that discussion this morning, I am joined by Gihan Gunasekera, who is an associate professor in commercial law at the University of Auckland, sitting two over from me. He's currently researching the implications of data sovereignty from its economic, technological, and Indigenous standpoints. Mercy King-Ore, who is a policy analyst from the Global Privacy Team with the Future Privacy Forum based in Kenya. And finally, but not least, my friend and colleague, Josefina Roman Vergara, Commissioner from the INAI in Mexico. So thank you for being with us. We thought it was a good idea maybe to do this panel a little bit differently than most panels. We want to, the voices of Indigenous people globally are obviously varied, as are views of privacy generally around the world. But we thought it was as good to include as many voices, at least to scratch the surface of Indigenous voices globally as we could. So in this panel, you will see perhaps a few more presentations on the screen than you normally would. They're not lengthy, but they kind of give a bit of an insight into the topic, I think, that can help guide us in that respect. So the first video that we wanted to share with you is from Dr. Tahu Kukutai, who's at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. A number of the people you'll see presenting would very much have liked to have been here actually to join us, but for resource and other reasons could not do so. So Dr. Kukutai will give us a bit of an overview of issues from perspective in her environs. And so perhaps if we could play that video now.
Kia ora, greetings. My name is Tahu Kukutai. I am Professor of Demography at the University of Waikato. I hail from the Ngāti Tipa, Ngāti Kinohaku and Te Ōpōuri tribes, and I'm a founding member of the Māori Data Sovereignty Network. So I'm just going to start my slideshow. So today I want to talk about Indigenous and particularly Māori perspectives on privacy, drawing on research from the Tikanga and Technology Project at the University of Waikato, and the URL is at the bottom of the slide. As you all well know, data privacy regulation focuses on the protection of personal data and personal data privacy. However, the Western emphasis on the atomistic individual contrasts with other traditions that see humans as relational beings whose identity and reality turns on their relationship with others. And this relational paradigm has implications for how we think about data and data privacy. When our team began developing the Māori Data Privacy Framework, we were interested to see if we could identify some shared features of Indigenous concepts of privacy, and what we found was this. Indigenous concepts of privacy are inherently collective, and are underpinned by Indigenous laws and protocols that determine when, how, and by whom information and knowledge can or should be shared. Indigenous collectives have the right to own and control information collectively in much the same way that an individual owns and controls her personal information. Where an individual's information is intermingled with others, one obvious example being ancestry and genetic data, then there is a collective privacy right, and recognising and upholding relationships of belonging and responsibility and respect are paramount. So for Indigenous peoples, the protection of personal data is just one part of a much wider set of data privacy considerations. So in recent years, Indigenous groups have developed their own data protection technologies to push back against data colonialism and to try and give their communities some sense of control over their information. A recent article shown here in Scientific American discusses some of these initiatives. One of them on the right-hand side is a Māori tech business called Aho, which is a free open source app developed for Māori to record ancestry data, maintain tribal registries, and share cultural narratives. And all of the information is encrypted on the user's device or to their own kinship group. So I want to give a brief snapshot of the Māori data privacy framework that our team has been working on. Despite there being no word for privacy in the Māori language, there are well-defined protocols or tikanga that are central to a Māori concept of privacy and that operate together to bring balance and order and to provide guidance when transgressed. So this is a visual of the core elements without all the detail that sits underneath. We begin with our atua or gods, Rangi Nui at the top, Sky Father, and Papatua Nuku at the bottom, Earth Mother. They protect the sanctity of our natural, social, and material worlds. Atua are our foundation, providing an enduring narrative of good spirit, connection, and identity for current and future generations. Atua remind us that data and data technologies are human creations that entail responsibilities and accountabilities. Whakapapa is at the centre of the framework. This refers to the genealogical layering and sequencing of relationships of all living things, from our founding ancestors to our digital versions of ourselves. Data are literally our relations. All data come from somewhere and someone. All individuals are part of a collective, whether they know it or not, and the collective is always more than a sum of its parts. We have 4 tikanga values that form the pillars of Māori data privacy. The first is mana. Mana is to hold binding authority or power over one's domain, including digital domains. Mana can be held by individuals and groups. For Māori, having mana in a digital environment means that we should be able to make decisions about how our personal and collective information is collected, stored, accessed, deleted, shared, and used, including secondary uses. Tapu is an essential element of a Māori privacy concept. Tapu defines what is special or restricted. In the context of data, tapu safeguards and upholds issues of data restrictions and sensitivity. This means that data that comes from Māori individuals or groups may still require restrictions in terms of how it is shared and used, even if it is de-identified. This also means, for example, that we should have the right to know if our data are being used to develop or train machines or algorithms, and the right to opt out. Modi, at the bottom, is the force of all life. Modi requires privacy laws and standards that protect Māori data as a taonga, a precious resource of tangible and intangible value. And finally, Hau is a vital essence of life that is shared by all living things. In digital worlds, Hau symbolises a state of balance based on a moral code of reciprocity. Hau requires privacy laws and standards that protect the qualities of equity and justice. Before I close, I would like to acknowledge our Council of Elders, our Kāhuiko Mātua, who worked with us on the framework shown here. Their hope is for a privacy paradigm that protects all of the digital lives of their grandchildren, now and yet to come, one that is grounded in a more holistic and relational practice of informational self-determination. Thank you.
So we would all like to thank Dr. Kukutai for providing that specific presentation for all of us here today on a global stage. She raises a number of important themes and principles, and one of those, I think, that stands out, I think, is the notion of privacy being a collective right as opposed to an individual right in Indigenous cultures. That's a question and an issue in Canada where I come from. My colleague Patricia Kasim, Commissioner Kasim from Ontario is here, who does a podcast, by the way, which I would strongly commend to you, put this question about collective rights of privacy and whether Indigenous people perhaps view privacy somewhat differently than our current legislative framework. She put that question to Jonathan Dewar, who is the First Nations Information Governance Center representative. And he was asked that question, and here is the answer that Patricia Kasim, Commissioner Kasim, received.
And speaking of our office, of course, as the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, I'm curious to know why privacy isn't mentioned as one of the OCAP principles. Was it not considered as important 25 years ago when these principles were developed, or do First Nations just have a different conception of privacy? Jonathan, what's the reason why privacy doesn't feature in your OCAP principles?
Yeah, it's a good question. Canadian law really falls down on this issue for First Nations because the focus is on the individual and not the collective. First Nations have a collective right to privacy, but where is the Canadian law that supports that? Well, it doesn't exist. First Nations, from time immemorial, have had concepts of privacy. They've had First Nations laws. Now, these would, of course, be in original languages, and not using the English word privacy. But that exists, and that knowledge is in communities, it's in First Nations. And so that has always been there. The problem has been Canadian law essentially overshadowing First Nations law. It's that imbalance of power that we talked about. And that's one of the things that we have to rectify within our work toward reconciliation, whatever that is. Canada and First Nations, if they're truly in nation-to-nation relationships, need to reconcile that. And so what can Canadian law do alongside First Nations law? First Nations law being the more ideal place to articulate what it means for the collective to have a right to privacy. So could there be a second P on OCAP? That's an interesting thought. We will certainly take that back into the collective conversation that we have. But I think there's a great deal of work that needs to be done within First Nations and with Canada to work through those issues. But the simple fact of the matter is, yes, First Nations have their own thinking on their own concepts of privacy, and Canadian law is insufficient.
And do you think Canadian privacy laws should evolve to include this collective notion of privacy or group notion of privacy?
Well, I'd go further than should and say it has to evolve. Canada can never achieve a harmonious nation-to-nation relationship with First Nations without it.
So thank you for that contribution, Commissioner Kasim and your guest. And I want to turn to Mercy on our panel, thinking about privacy as a collective notion, how that resonates in Kenya and in Africa.
Yeah, so I think the last video really encapsulates what privacy and collective privacy looks like, even in Africa. And what really is at the core of collective privacy is the communal way of living of communities, okay? So what Indigenous communities are requesting, or they're asking data protection regulations to have, is to cover these aspects of communal living. And what ideally is communal ways of living, because it in itself has its own features. It's a consultative process. It's a process that involves taking into consideration the sensitivities of what is particular to them. And I'm sure as we proceed, there will be a discussion on what these sensitivities are. But ideally, collective privacy, and that's why it's sort of, in a very big way, different from individual forms of privacy. And as was mentioned here, is because of these nuances that communities carry and the values that they have, especially the issue of values, because these values are shared among so many people. They now are expecting that these values could be transplanted in data protection laws.
Thanks for that. And Gihan, from your studies in New Zealand and looking at these issues, what resonates with you about this?
Well, I'd like to reflect, echo those sentiments that your speaker in the podcast mentioned. And I don't know how things are in Canada, but certainly in New Zealand, Indigenous resources, if we think of land and water and other resources in New Zealand, the Maori people generally, those resources are held collectively and decisions about them are made collectively. So there's no reason to think that data would be any different. So the important thing is decision making is not made by the individual. It's a collective in which, of course, the individual would participate. The other point I would make is that mainstream, I mean, we've heard a lot at this conference about groups of collectives of people and the importance of collective, which is groups acting together to protect their information, which is not something that mainstream privacy laws cover. But of course, Indigenous people have been doing this all along. So we could argue that really privacy is a newcomer to this, and Indigenous people have long since had the answer to this. Scholars such as Luciana Floridi and others have argued for group privacy rights and for collective action in regard to data privacy. And that autonomy can be only exercised in this way, not at the individual level. Finally, in New Zealand, we have groups such as Te Mana Raronga, which is a New Zealand, the Maori Data Sovereignty Network, and they have put out several very good publications, and their website contains a set of principles for Maori data sovereignty. And that talks about the importance of acting collectively, but it also contains a formula for how to reconcile conflicts within the collective and resorting to Indigenous values that have a formula for how to balance where there's a tension, which can arise from time to time. Those values it's an alternative value system, drawing on concepts such as whanaungatanga and rangitiritanga and so on. But we have ways of dealing with that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And a couple of one of the things you're talking about in terms of collective rights, it means exerting some control and ownership about how information is shared and distributed and collected in Indigenous societies, and how our own legal regimes interact with that. That's really a fundamentally important issue, which I think has arisen in a number of jurisdictions globally. And we just want to share with you a Canadian video, but I think it sort of deals with issues that have broader implications beyond Canada. So this is from the Canadian First Nations Information Governance Centre to help explain a little bit briefly about the issue of control and ownership of data.
For millennia, First Nations ways of living, knowing, and being were protected. Our languages, our identities, and our sovereignty thrived. We were safe, we were strong. But with colonization, our sovereignty and the right to determine our own futures came under threat. Control and ownership over our ways of knowing and being began to break down, creating a void between who we are today and who the Creator intended us to be. Yet despite these hardships, we are a strong and resilient people with a proud history and an even brighter future. In this era of reconciliation, a new story is being written. This story sees us taking back what is ours. It sees us exercising our rights to self-determination and self-government. But to do this, we must also exercise our rights over our information, over our knowledge, over our data. In a rapidly evolving digital economy, data in the form of information, statistics, and research is key. To date, Canada has been and is still collecting our data, comparing our quality of life, and planning our futures without our input or consent. We have been forced to fit into a mold that is not of our making or of our choosing. So we are at a loss for reliable, relevant data that speaks for us from our worldview. Our data must belong to us.
And so for Indigenous people, as I've learned a lot through the work that I've done as commissioner, this is more than an academic exercise. History is replete with examples of data being collected from Indigenous peoples and being used in ways that were never either consented to or expected. The place where I live in Victoria, BC, on Vancouver Island, a number of years ago, blood samples were taken from the Nuu-chah-nulth people with their consent, with a view to looking at genetic data around arthritic conditions that seem to have been inherited. So they wanted to study that, a very good thing to do. What later transpired, they found out there was no genetic link, but the information from those samples was reused, I think, at least 7 or 8 times for other purposes without asking any consent. So obviously raising issues of control that, again, there are many instances and other examples of this. That is just one of them. So in terms of the ownership and control issue and thinking about this in terms of regimes globally, I'm going to come back to Gihan and ask for your thoughts on that issue.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'm also somewhat humbled by some of these your contributors. And I should add that I'm not an Indigenous person, at least I'm not Indigenous to New Zealand. My family immigrated from Sri Lanka to New Zealand when I was very young, so I've spent pretty much my whole life in New Zealand, but I'm not of Indigenous ancestry. But I'm encouraged to hear the sentiments by the various Indigenous speakers and contributors. We have in New Zealand, the issue of control is paramount. The Te Mana Raronga that I referred to, the Maori Data Sovereignty Network has put out its ideals and goals. And these are challenging to those of us who are information privacy scholars and practitioners, because they suggest that even information that is not PI, not personal information, where the identifiers have been stripped out and it's anonymized and perhaps aggregated with other data sets, those should also be still subject to some control from the people whose data it was originally collected from. To the extent that the Indigenous people should still have a right to retrieve that data, even once it's been de-identified, even from aggregated and anonymized data sets. And there's also a very recent paper put out by, we heard earlier from my colleague Tahu Kukutai. Now she is at the University of Waikato, and they have recently put out a paper on Maori data sovereignty and privacy specifically. And in that paper, they make the point that there should perhaps be a right to block the use of data, where data is being used to reveal sensitive things about the Maori people and perhaps reveal aspects of their culture and where there are particular sensitivities. There should be an ability to block or perhaps have that data removed in the same way that GDPR allows you to erase data, or perhaps a right to object. So that raises some interesting issues. The other thing that's come out of some of these writings is that the scholars have suggested that they're not asked after the information just for its own sake, not to control the information just for its own sake, but the data should be used for good. And so in other words, to turn the Google formula, do no evil, to turn that around and saying, make sure you do good with data. In other words, data is useless unless you actually do something beneficial with it. So research for its own sake is discouraged, at least amongst the Maori networks that I have associated with. And then a good example of how this formula has been implemented in New Zealand law is the Kaitiaki regulations of 1995. This deals with, we have a national cancer cervical screening system in New Zealand where everyone is screened, and that data goes into a huge, once it's been obviously collected, it gets de-identified and it goes into a huge database, which is very valuable for researchers to research the incidence and prevalence of cervical cancer. But whereas the Maori data is concerned, even though the identity of the people are not known, the fact that they are Maori is retained, and any data involving people of Maori descent need to be obtained through this guardianship council that it has the power to veto any research that they don't think will be beneficial. So that's an example. And more recently in New Zealand, we have had struggles for control over COVID-19 data. In the height of the pandemic, the Maori population was lagging about 22% behind the general population in vaccination rates. And there was a huge deficit there. And Maori health providers were very effective in reaching out to their communities. And they said to the government, the Ministry of Health, give us the names and addresses of those people who are not vaccinated. And the government said, no, privacy, we can't give you that information. So the Maori organization took the government to court. And there were a couple of cases, high-profile cases. And in both of those cases, they were successfully challenged the government that was forced to reconsider its decision. One of the claims the government made was that Maori themselves had sovereignty in the data, and this would offend the tribes, the iwi, who would argue that's their data, so data sovereignty. So the Crown used that as a defense. But that was struck down because the court got expert witnesses from within the Maori community that basically said where there is a tension there, and this Maori organization, by the way, was administering vaccines to the entire Maori population, irrespective of their tribal affiliation. So they didn't care which iwi and so on might claim, and there was no time to get consent from all the iwi because by that stage everyone would have got COVID. So time was of the essence. And the court agreed, and the expert witnesses said that the Maori values that were applied in that case were whanaungatanga, respectful relationships, which has also been referred to by Justice Joe Williams of our Supreme Court. He's a judge of Maori descent. He's described whanaungatanga as the underpinning principle of the first law of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And rangitiritanga, those people in leadership positions within the Maori community had a duty to protect the health and well-being of their community. And to claim that any one iwi had ownership of the data, the court rejected that. The expert witnesses said, yes, data is a taonga, something of value, but the life and health of the community has a higher status. And so this is interesting because the Maori values principle structure was used to basically reconcile intra-Maori arguments as to who should have access to the data. So these are some of the battles that have been fought and I think overcome in New Zealand.
Thanks for that, Gihan. And Mercy, from your perspective in Kenya and Africa, what observations would you have to offer?
Yeah, so I think the issue of ownership and control still is rife in Kenya, and also speaking generally for Africa, because and as we're going to show, like indigenous communities do form a huge part of the continent. But I think it's very important to note that the state of indigenous communities, and just listening to what Professor Gerhan is saying, is that compared to what is happening in Australia, the indigenous communities in Africa do suffer from intersectional problems, because what you find is that indigenous communities also do experience a lot of marginalization. They are yet to really be seen fully. So we are not seeing things like the Maori Data Sovereignty Network, and there is still a lot to be done. And because of all of this, what we are seeing is that even when their data is collected, what we observe is that their data is mostly, there is a context within which their data is used. Most of it is either for aid, for research, as you mentioned with the blood sample, it's also happening in the continent. And what this does is that most of these data uses tend to fall outside the exemptions of data protection laws, and therefore exposes them a lot to issues of data protection. And therefore there's been, and also it's important that to mention that this also causes them to relieve ownership and control of these forms of data. And what we're also seeing that's raising ownership and control issues is how indigenous communities who are now living among what I'd term the rest of the communities there is the use of personal data away from what I'd call typical uses of data among Indigenous communities, which is, as I said, like aid. And so what is happening in Indigenous communities, at least in Africa, are now also accessing the internet like any other person, and they are using these technologies, and their data is being processed in these systems. So what this also raises is, again, other issues of ownership and control. And now they find themselves in the data protection ecosystem, and their challenges compound again because there's the issue of literacy, okay? So we're seeing a lot of lack. They really don't, I can't say there's really gotten a hold of proper how to control their data compared to what I'm hearing from Professor Gerhan. So these are the risks that we are seeing among African Indigenous communities.
Yeah, and to further pick up on that theme, we invited a colleague, Grace Matanga from Africa, to just briefly expand on this. And so if we just could have that brief video, that would be great.
Good day from wherever you are. My name is Grace Mutungu. I am a technology policy researcher based in Africa. And I have observed the development of data protection technology laws in the past 15 years. And this is what I'd say about Indigenous people and data. The first is a definitional issue where I would argue that in Africa, most of the people are Indigenous. You find that majority of the population in the continent have been there for 5, 6, 10 generations, and therefore they are Indigenous to the continent because they have been there in the recent past. However, there are also levels to indigeneity, and because citizenship is a political process in most countries, various groups face various issues, and these issues are also coming out in the digital economy. For example, we have seen cases of people going to court because they have been denied an opportunity to participate in the digital economy, for example, by being excluded from national digital identification programs. And so there are levels to indigeneity. The second point I'd like to make is the way policymaking and the laws have not been indigenous. We have transplanted laws from other places. One of the laws that is most adopted in African countries, for example, in the data protection regime, is GDPR. And while it is a good law and it has its advantages, there are also some nuances that are missed when such laws are brought into the continent. An example that is relevant for Indigenous people and their data is the issue of collective rights, whereby GDPR kind of laws tend to require that for a complaint to be made, it has to be made by an individual. In practice, Indigenous communities have collective representation, collective ways of making decisions, and collective ways.
There had to be a technical issue at some point in this production. I don't know if we're able to, well, let's, I would just continue on to say, I know one of the points that Grace is making is that the challenges, and she actually challenges regulators to think about these issues in terms of how we engage with Indigenous communities, in terms of their wanting, we as regulators often get individual complaints, but there's collective elements to this. There are a whole range of issues at various Indigenous communities that differ. I know in Mexico, Josefina, this is something that you have had to think very deeply about at the INAI because of the range of Indigenous communities and how the INAI interacts with Indigenous communities and the law. And I wonder if you could share that with us and some of your experience.
Gracias.
Muy buenos días, gracias Michael. Yo quiero darles, antes de iniciar, algunos datos que me parecen muy interesantes. Miren, en la mayoría de los países, los alumnos que reciben educación y es básica la primaria, reciben la educación en una lengua materna diferente. El 40% de la población mundial no tiene acceso a una educación en la lengua que habla. Pero en el caso de México, ¿qué pasa? En México tenemos más de 2.450 municipios. De 23.2 millones de mexicanos que somos, se autoidentifican como indígenas el 30.8% de la población. En México se hablan 68 lenguas indígenas. Y un dato que hay que tomar en cuenta es que de cada 100 personas, 12 personas, además de que hablan una lengua indígena, no hablan español. Entonces, el hecho de recibir la educación básica en una lengua que no hablan, pues evidentemente ese es de los más graves problemas que tenemos. En México, a partir de 2001, realizamos una reforma a la Constitución Política de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, y en donde se reconoce como un derecho fundamental la libre autodeterminación de los pueblos originarios. En este artículo 2 constitucional, evidentemente se reconoce en principio que la composición pluricultural de México está sustentada justamente en sus pueblos originarios. Se reconocen derechos fundamentales y para efectos de esta materia, lo más importante que hay que decir es que este artículo 2 constitucional reconoce el derecho a la autodeterminación. De hecho, dice libre determinación, además de, por supuesto, autonomía para decidir sobre formas internas de convivencia, organización social, económica, política. Uno de los ejemplos más importantes que yo quería mencionar este día es que una de las 32 entidades federativas que tenemos en México, seguramente alguna vez habrán escuchado, en el sur del país está el estado de Oaxaca. Oaxaca tiene 570 municipios y de esos 570 municipios, 417 corresponden a usos y costumbres. Esto significa que los pueblos originarios en México tienen la posibilidad de esa autodeterminación informativa. Como ya está en el artículo 2, esta autonomía, entre comillas, que tienen los pueblos originarios, la legislación en materia de protección de datos personales en México la diferenciamos, por un lado, la ley general que aplica a instituciones públicas, incluyendo a todas las entidades federales, estatales y municipales, y la ley de protección de datos que aplica a todos los particulares. Los pueblos originarios, por este artículo 2, tienen la posibilidad de tomar sus propias decisiones políticas, económicas, administrativas, pero el ejercicio de los derechos contemplados en la legislación mexicana lo ejercen como todo mexicano. Un ejemplo interesante es una definición que la Ley de Transparencia en México dice como ajustes razonables. Nos ha tocado en muchas ocasiones en donde una persona que habla maya, es la lengua más hablada en México y algunos países de Centroamérica, hace una solicitud de acceso a información en lengua maya, y las autoridades tenemos obligación de hacer la respuesta en lengua maya. Desde el INAI les comparto que, por ejemplo, dentro del presupuesto tenemos un apartado especial para realizar respuestas, resolver quejas, recursos en la lengua originaria de la persona que hace una solicitud. Lo mismo aplicaría para el ejercicio de derechos de acceso, rectificación, cancelación y oposición en el tema de datos personales. Y bueno, solo para finalizar, otro ejemplo muy interesante que hay, sobre todo en el sur del país, donde de estas 68 lenguas originarias que se hablan en México, 5 son los que mayormente hablan mexicanos y mexicanas. De estas hay ejercicios muy interesantes, como en el estado de Chiapas, en donde una universidad multicultural enseña hasta el nivel superior, hasta el nivel de universidad, en diferentes lenguas originarias, además del español. Entonces, esta universidad inclusive llega a dar apoyo a diferentes instituciones públicas para que intérpretes certificados puedan hacer estas respuestas tanto en materia de acceso a información pública para la mejor toma de decisiones de pueblos originarios, como en materia del ejercicio de sus derechos en materia de protección de datos personales. Gracias, Michael.
Gracias. I'm sure by now one has a sense of the global nature of these issues and themes. And in fact, it's an issue that's been addressed by the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I should say, parenthetically, in British Columbia, our legislature has adopted that United Nations Declaration, which has considerable legal implications for the work that we do as a regulator. So I thought it was probably just to spend a moment and ask Ihan if he can just remind us of some of the key elements of that United Nations Declaration and how that will absolutely impact matters globally.
Yeah, sure. But just before doing that, I should say I'm very heartened to hear from the Commissioner that there are universities in her country that people can study in their Indigenous languages. We also have a university in New Zealand, a national university, where the Te Reo is the language of our Maori people, and they can undertake study. And I'm increasingly challenged at the University of Auckland by students who enroll and demand to do their assessments in Te Reo. So we can't always comply, but we're trying our best. So it's an increasing global trend. But the question was regarding United Nations, and I think that's a really good perspective to consider, because the United Nations gives legitimacy, I guess, to the Indigenous rights movement. There is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, which was signed, I think, quite some years ago, around 2007, I believe. And New Zealand and Australia and Canada, and I think the United States have all acceded to that. In New Zealand with some reluctance initially. But it's a non-binding declaration, but it has moral standing. And it has a number of articles that I think Indigenous people can look to. One of them is, that I've picked out, is Article 33. Indigenous people have the right to determine their own identity in accordance with their values and customs. So, you know, identity is something that is sometimes arbitrarily assigned by governments and other organizations to decide if somebody has got a legitimate, valid identity. Well, Indigenous people have the right to determine their own identity according to their own values. And Article 35 talks about the individual's responsibilities to their community, to the community that they belong to. So in other words, there's a reciprocity here. And this comes back to, in New Zealand, the value of whanaungatanga. It's a two-way interchange. It's not just the individual saying, I have rights against everyone. The individual must also have obligations to their community. Now, the United Nations I know the current special rapporteur is attending this event, but her predecessor, Joe Kanatachi, who I was very lucky to meet when he visited New Zealand some years ago, has issued several reports, and one of them is specifically on Indigenous data sovereignty, and uses the United Nations principles from the UNDRIP declaration as the legitimizing grounds for that. But the special rapporteur has said there are two things to really consider. The first is the principle of Indigenous data sovereignty. So that's the overarching sort of principle that gives value to Indigenous people's rights. But underneath that, there is the need for Indigenous data governance. So that's at the practical level. How do we implement that principle of Indigenous data sovereignty in practice? And he has suggested that the only way to do that is through Indigenous data governance, where the rules themselves are promulgated by Indigenous peoples. The leadership in that regard is also within Indigenous communities, and those leaders are then held accountable according to those same values. So in other words, it's got to be homegrown, it's got to be organic, and not something imposed by a colonial kind of imposition. So that's what really self-determination in the data space means, according to the Special Rapporteur. And those reports are certainly worth reading. The Special Rapporteur didn't sit behind a desk and draft that report. He went all around the world. He went to the most remote communities in the middle of Australia and so on, and spoke to people on the ground, and it's really worth reading that report.
Thank you. Thank you, Gihan. In terms of the work we've done as panelists in thinking about these issues, I wanted to ask our panelists just what messages, what lessons we've kind of thought about and learned. I just reflect on some of my own thoughts as a regulator and thinking through some of these issues, and particularly those of us in North America who go to these sessions frequently, and probably not just in North America, but other places. The beginning of privacy generally starts with the Brandeis and Warren picture from the Harvard Law Review in 1890, and if you want to bring it a little more up to date, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, and if you really want to get modern, the OECD principles in 1980. But I have to say, reflecting myself, I have to say that view is, to be fair to myself, somewhat ignorant of history and somewhat ignorant of the traditions that have long predated the evolution of what's happened to us in North American society. I also think as we struggle, not just as regulators, but as a society, thinking about issues that we'd previously thought about as individual transactions, giving over your driver's license to get a certain thing and a complaint being lodged, now into the world of AI, where the implications are so much societal as opposed to individual. How do we grapple with that? How is that written into the work we do as regulators? I think there's a lot of wisdom to be found amongst our Indigenous peoples in our respective jurisdictions about some of those issues. Those were some of my thoughts. Mercy, from your perspective and work, what are your parting thoughts in thinking and considering these issues?
Yeah, so I think you correctly said that the initial definition of privacy, as we understand it from Warren and Brandeis, definitely has its own limitations. But I think that's also an opportunity for us, because as we all know, the right to privacy, privacy in itself is still not defined. So more than being problematic, that offers an opportunity for us to reimagine privacy. There's an opportunity for us to stretch it and reshape the idea of privacy, how to cater for Indigenous communities and their needs and values, as Professor Gehan has highlighted them. And also paying attention in considering the rights of Indigenous communities, the right to privacy. It's very important, at least from where I come from, to consider what the impact of the levels of indigeneity that Grace tried to raise on the impact of privacy on communities. And I say this because from my stand, levels of indigeneity really impact how I enjoy privacy and how someone of indigenous nature, yet marginalized, enjoys privacy, okay? Because for those that suffer of also marginalization, the opportunities for them to come together and form things like data sovereignty networks still isn't possible, okay? So levels of indigeneity are very important when considering the right to privacy. And I think also one of the things that Indigenous communities and privacy offers us is it really allows us to have those moments of, yes, we know we can use this data, but should we, okay? And also, it's very important for us when dealing with Indigenous communities and privacy to seek them out. Because what happens is, and again, I just speak from where I come from, is the levels of awareness of even these forms of data collection is still low. So we might talk about them enforcing their rights, but awareness of these rights, is it even there? So I think that would be my parting shot, just to consider all these 4 issues when dealing with Indigenous communities, their right to privacy and data protection.
Yeah, that's such an important point about reaching out, and it's something that I think many of us, I know in Canada, think about reaching out to communities and taking the initiative to do that, which is really important. Gihan, did you have any concluding thoughts?
Yes, I'm also very intrigued by what Mercy said about, I mean, these are issues that are, I'm sure, present in other countries, equity, the access to technology, sort of literacy. I mean, these basic things we take for granted. And where there's social and economic deprivation, then, rights are of less meaning because people don't have the ability to exercise those rights. So I completely agree with you, Mercy, as far as that aspect goes. Just in terms of some parting thoughts, I think it's interesting when we look at Indigenous perspectives and the research and the literature. It suggests that there's a similar track here to the tensions that Indigenous people have experienced with intellectual property, exercising intellectual property rights. Because the traditional categories of intellectual property don't cater well to Indigenous knowledge. And that's been a global problem in New Zealand as well as in other jurisdictions. It just doesn't fit the existing sort of the intellectual property categories of copyright, patent, and so on. And I think we're going to see similar pressure on the prevailing notions of information privacy. What is personally identifiable information? What is PI? Quantified data does not necessarily recognize what Indigenous people refer to as the other ways of knowing. There are other ways of knowing than quantified data. One of the things I would like to end with is to talk about the connection between people, places, and things. So the Māori talk about, Atahu talked about that in her presentation earlier today, but there's a link between individuals, the places they come from, and the objects and things that they hold of value. Now, of course, we live now in the Internet of Things, where things are connected, but perhaps Indigenous people knew that all along, because there has always been this connection between objects, things, and places, and individuals. And in the Māori world, and I'm sure it is the same in other Indigenous cultures, there is a spiritual element as well, the metaphysical. There is something that we cannot explain. And if you think about some of the things that now data scientists are discovering with big data, we can't explain it, but we know it exists. Now, Indigenous people have always known that. And that's perhaps with some sense of humility, perhaps we should recognize that. So I think in my parting thoughts, I would say that's something to think about.
Yeah, thanks for that. Josefina.
Bien, yo quisiera dejar sobre la mesa el tema de que en México la Constitución establece como derecho fundamental ya la libertad de los pueblos originarios para regirse por usos y costumbres. Sin embargo, la legislación en materia de protección de datos, tanto para instituciones públicas como para privados, les otorga el mismo derecho a los más de 23.2 millones de mexicanos que somos de la misma manera. Me parece que una muy importante diferencia para ejercer en la práctica el derecho a la privacidad y el derecho a la protección de los datos personales es un poco los sistemas de educación que debieran ser completamente inclusivos. Es alarmante el dato de que de las personas que hablan una lengua originaria, de cada 100, 12 solo hablan español y no reciben una educación básica en la lengua originaria que hablan, pues difícilmente alguien ejerce un derecho que no lo conoce. Entonces, me parece que el punto que yo quisiera dejar sobre la mesa es que los sistemas de educación sean absolutamente inclusivos. Y también tomar en cuenta que si una persona busca ejercer sus derechos o obligar a que aquellas personas públicas o privadas que hagan tratamiento de datos personales bajo cualquier argumento o finalidad cumplan estrictamente con lo que la legislación establece en principios, deberes y obligaciones, que la posibilidad de exigirlo se dé también en su lengua originaria. Porque en México, como ustedes saben, tenemos la plataforma llamada Plataforma Nacional de Transparencia, pero es una vía en donde hoy, hasta en un teléfono celular, una persona que habla una lengua originaria puede ejercer sus derechos, tanto de acceso a información pública como de protección de datos personales. Lo que no tenemos al 100% es esta posibilidad de interpretación simultánea para dar respuesta en la lengua originaria de que se trate. Y finalmente, yo quisiera mostrarles, en México identificamos que hay 6 lenguas originarias que son las que mayormente se hablan. La más conocida es maya, porque no es exclusiva de México. Y entonces hicimos unas guías de protección de datos personales que hemos presentado en diversas entidades federativas que son donde mayormente se hablan lenguas originarias. También debo reconocer, y espero que abone en otros países, identificamos que este es un primer paso, tener guías en lenguas originarias en papel. Inclusive las hicimos, tratamos de hacer coloridas, llamativas, en lenguaje ciudadano, nada técnico. Pero también nos dijeron repetidamente quienes hablan lenguas originarias que en 6 de las que más se hablan en México, mayormente las lenguas originarias se escuchan y se hablan. Se leen, pero se leen poco. Entonces, el reto también es identificar cuál es la necesidad real de estos pueblos originarios para que puedan ejercer de manera igualitaria y equitativa sus derechos, todos, incluyendo el de protección de datos personales. Y en México, el derecho de acceso a la información, que ha servido para pueblos originarios en la mejor toma de decisiones. La segunda etapa, por supuesto, que tenemos el reto es hablar. No sé, serán audios, serán videos, pero ya no solamente papel. Gracias.
Yes, adding to the complexity and the challenges, and I would say, Alex, I appreciate you having put this item on the agenda, because this is really, in a sense, just, I would say, I said scratching the surface, and it is. The issues are deeply complex and span the globe. We have a couple of minutes, not a lot, but we have a couple of minutes for questions or comments from some of you who may want to share your own experiences in your own jurisdictions. And I see a person, Sean, in fact, Newfoundland and Labrador, my own country. Sean.
Hello. Yes, this has been a fascinating session, and I think not just only because of what we're learning about the conception of privacy in Indigenous communities, but thinking about how this approach to privacy can actually potentially represent a new paradigm for all of our approaches to privacy. As you've mentioned, Michael, I mean, so much of the conference yesterday, we were hearing about the importance of considering the sort of broader societal impacts of how data is used. And that this seems to be very much in line with what we're hearing in terms of how Indigenous communities approach the use of their data from a broader perspective. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has any thoughts about how we can apply the principles that we're hearing about that are being used in Indigenous communities in terms of data use and data sovereignty. Are there broader lessons for us as regulators who are looking at statutes that are oriented entirely to individual uses of and consent and things like that. Are there lessons that we can draw as we look at sort of adapting to this new world with technology, but also considering the people who have always been there around us, our Indigenous populations that live with us? Thank you.
I would just quickly say in British Columbia, one of the things we now have to and are considering is how complaints are made to our office. So it's a very much individual based. There doesn't seem on the surface to be a vehicle for collective complaints where communities can come to us as a group to make a complaint. But that is, when you think about the cultural issues that we've raised today, not only appropriate, but arguably perhaps legally compelled at some stage given the adoption of the declaration in British Columbia. But I would turn it over to other panelists if you have thoughts on that.
Just very briefly, I think one of the responses I would have is to say to use whatever rights are within your own jurisdiction's legislation. I know in New Zealand we now have the possibility of collective complaints, representative complaints, and representative litigation is specifically allowed under our legislation. So if the legislation allows that, that gives a point of, but it needs better education to educate people that these rights already exist. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, of course, that doesn't necessarily address the collective aspect. How does, if you're going to have groups of people coming together in data collectives, there's no legislation that currently allows that. And maybe that's the next stage for some kind of legislative development.
Yeah, so I think, so in addition to group claims, I think one of the things that the existing data protection frameworks do provide for us and are important for Indigenous communities is provision specifically on sensitive personal data, because most of what we see for Indigenous communities is that the desire to protect certain forms of data. And so depending on the country that we're talking about, what the law provides on sensitive personal data can also be instrumental. And I'm also thinking about visibility, because you mentioned about modern technologies, and because at the end of the day, we also don't want technologies that are also exclusionary, so we need to also process their personal data. But it's also, we also have to deal with the dilemma of, do they really even want visibility under certain forms of data? So it really depends on what the context is, but I think our data protection laws are a good starting point, having understood what features of Indigenous communities we are dealing with.
Sí. Yo quisiera reflexionar en el tema de que me parece que las personas de pueblos originarios que hablan una lengua originaria, lo que tenemos que hacer es garantizar que tengan exactamente los mismos derechos en materia de protección de datos personales. El tema, por ejemplo, en México es cómo garantizar que una persona que habla y escribe español pueda ejercer su derecho a la protección de los datos personales exactamente igual que una persona que habla maya. Una de las limitantes es, por ejemplo, nos han dicho reiteradamente, para escribir del español a maya no es una traducción, es una interpretación, porque cada lengua originaria puede tener muchas más especificaciones. Entonces, es caro en México hacer una resolución de 100 cuartillas, por ejemplo, nos resulta muy caro porque lo hace un especialista en la materia y es certificado para asegurarnos que le estamos haciendo llegar, diciendo lo que él va a entender. Entonces, se requiere presupuesto. Hemos aprendido a hacer cuando hay que hacer esta interpretación del español a un maya, a un zapoteco, a un mixteco, en lugar de hacer resoluciones de 100 cuartillas, hacemos de 10, de 12 cuartillas, porque nos permite llegar a más. Pero creo que es un gran reto poder en el momento saber qué está solicitando, de qué manera se le puede ayudar y si no, tener la capacidad institucional de resolver el poder dialogar.
I don't know if we have time for one more comment or question. Very quickly, I'm cognizant of the time. You have no idea behind here how they give you flashing lights until you get up on the stage and see that. But if I could just invite, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This one's, guess, not working. My name is Rosemary Miners. I've lived here in Bermuda for 18 years, but I am Canadian, more specifically from Manitoba, Winnipeg, Manitoba, where we just had a historical win by an Indigenous person as a premier. So my question kind of stems around representation. So just from your perspective, how is representation changing within the landscape of all your, I guess, your countries in the sense of having rights, Indigenous people having a say in the legislation and as well their data privacy rights? And that's not a quick question.
Right. Well, my 15-second answer would be Premier Canoe, that's an incredible event in Manitoba. The other thing I would say is we are not doing a good enough job, certainly within our office, in terms of developing more representation of Indigenous people on staff. It's something that our team is not just looking at, but actively when we hire and think about these issues, we have to be more inclusive in the people we put in our office and are reaching out. I don't know if there's others that, Josefina.
Yo solamente insistir en que primero hay que asegurarnos que le estamos concientizando que tiene derechos fundamentales, que debe de conocerlos, que hay instituciones públicas, en el caso de México, en los 3 niveles de gobierno, federal, estatal, municipal, para atenderlo y tener esa capacidad también tecnológica de responder lo más pronto posible a lo que los pueblos originarios requieran.
So I do see now, we are now over time. This is the beginning of a conversation. And again, I'm very grateful to the organizers here in Bermuda to put this on the agenda to start this conversation. I want to thank Josefina, Gihan, and Mercy for her contributions to this panel, and if you could all thank them as well.
Thank you again to our speakers, and I've just been informed that those guides that Commissioner Rahman had will be available downstairs in the registration area if anyone's interested in seeing those. So I'm honored and humbled at this stage to share the stage at this time as we present the Global Privacy Assembly's 3rd annual award, named in memory of former European Data Protection Supervisor Giovanni Buttarelli, recognizing leadership at the international level and cooperation. So please join me in welcoming back to the stage, after a very short departure, Josefina Ramon Vergara, Commissioner of the Data Protection Authority of Mexico, which serves as chair of the Global Privacy Assembly. Thank you. Okay. Just one moment.
Gracias de nueva cuenta. Muy buenos días tengan todas y todos ustedes. Gracias, Alex. Bien,
A nombre del Pleno del Instituto Nacional de Transparencia, Acceso a la Información y Protección de Datos Personales de México, el INAI, antes que nada les quiero dar un cordial saludo de quienes integramos este Pleno. Estuvo con nosotros la comisionada presidenta Blanca Lilia Ibarra, también Norma Julieta del Río y Adrián Alcalá. Me complace mucho estar aquí el día de hoy para llevar a cabo la entrega del premio Giovanni Buttarelli en su tercera edición. Este galardón fue creado, como ustedes saben, para reconocer y honrar a aquellas personas que han buscado crear una gobernanza más justa, ética y también responsable del derecho a la privacidad y a la protección de los datos personales. En este sentido, resaltamos la importancia de contar con liderazgos fuertes y ambiciosos que sean capaces de impulsar nuevos entendimientos y conocimientos sobre la importancia que adquiere la tutela de los derechos humanos en un ambiente de intempestivos cambios tecnológicos. El día de hoy nos sentimos muy honrados de estar frente a nuestra comunidad de autoridades para reconocer los logros de una de las grandes líderes mundiales en la protección de la privacidad y los datos personales, la doctora Andrea Jelinek, otrora presidenta del Comité Europeo de Protección de Datos y jefa de la Autoridad Austriaca de Protección de Datos. La doctora Jelinek es una abogada destacada en la materia de protección de datos y defensa de la privacidad a nivel global, cuya especialización en el derecho de asilo e inmigración contribuyó a determinar su carrera. Cuenta con una amplia experiencia y reconocida trayectoria profesional. En 2003 fue la primera mujer de Viena en ser nombrada como jefa de la oficina del comisionado de policía y ha ocupado diversos cargos importantes, entre los que destacan el de funcionaria jurídica en la Secretaría General de la Conferencia de Rectores de Austria y el de jefe de Departamento Jurídico y Legislativo en el Ministerio Interior. La voluntad y compromiso de la doctora Jelinek con el fortalecimiento de las redes globales y los esfuerzos para incorporar el cumplimiento normativo del Reglamento General de Protección de Datos dentro de los países de la Unión Europea es encomiable. En su labor como jefa de la Autoridad de Protección de Datos en Austria, logró que este país se distinga por ser uno de los primeros en adaptar sus políticas nacionales al reglamento europeo, así como por sus sólidas medidas de control de la información personal. Sin más preámbulo, demos por favor un cálido aplauso a la doctora Andrea Jelinek, pues este reconocimiento no es sino una muestra más de que su trayectoria ha dejado una huella imborrable que habrá de guiar y orientar nuestros esfuerzos para lograr un balance efectivo entre el aprovechamiento de los avances tecnológicos y la tutela de los derechos humanos en los tiempos que vivimos. Le damos un cálido aplauso a la doctora.
Thank you, Wojciech. I'm honored to accept this award and to have my work recognized in such a way by my esteemed colleagues. It has truly been one of the most rewarding experiences of my working life to have been the very first chair of the European Data Protection Board. The opportunity to build this new EU body from scratch and to help guide the implementation of the GDPR from the very beginning was a challenge like no other. Of course, I could not have done this on my own. They say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it took more than 30 DPAs, all their staff, as well as the ETPS, to build the European Data Protection Board, not to mention the dedicated and tireless work of each and everyone at the ETPP Secretariat. I have been very lucky to have had all of you by my side during these last 5 years. It is through the excellent cooperation between the European DPAs that the ETPP is what it is today, a unique decision-making body with a far-reaching impact, well respected in Europe and beyond. This award is not just a recognition of my work, but of all the work we have accomplished together since 2018. To have been a primus inter pares, a first amongst equals, among the European DPAs has been incredibly rewarding. Not one day went by when I did not learn something from my fellow heads of DPAs, and I will always cherish this experience. I could not be happier that this hard work is now being recognized by the most important international forum for data protection, the GPA. I gladly accept this award on behalf of the entire ETPP, and I'm especially honored to be given an award that is named after one of the guiding stars of data protection who left us too soon, but whose ideas live on and inspire us still today. Thank you, Giovanni. I wish you all a very successful conference and interesting meetings. Thanks again to all of you.
Muchas gracias. Muy bien, doctora Andrea Jelinek, por supuesto que le haremos llegar creemos que está muy bonito, por supuesto que se lo haremos llegar. Muy bien, ahora le daremos el uso de la voz a Golczek, por favor. Lo dejo aquí.
Thank you very much for this award on the behalf of Andrea and all the members of the European Data Protection Board. As the first chair of the EDPB, Andrea Jelinek was a real trailblazer, shaping and building the EDPB into what it is today. This award commemorates this achievement. It is my honor to be her successor and accept this award on her behalf. Thank you.
And of course, it's only fitting now to hear from the current European Data Protection Supervisor, Wojciech Wywierowski. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was supposed to say these few words before giving the award to Andrea, but I have to say them. I really have to say them. Dear members and observers of the Global Privacy Assembly, I would like to thank, first of all, the Executive Committee for their efforts to remember about Giovanni and about his role in setting up this conference and the road to this conference through the international one organized by Giovanni in 2018 in Brussels, by his vision. And I'm thankful also to Giovanni's family, to Serena, Gianluca, Eleonora, for their fundamental support to the initiative of the award. Professor Shoshana Zuboff and Elizabeth Denham were two first and remarkable recipients of the award, and I could hardly think of a more honorable and distinguished recipient of the third edition than Andrea. Andrea has played a role of a head of Austrian Data Protection Authority, and her career was not the typical one for the data protection. She worked for the Ministry of Interior, she worked for the police, she worked for the law enforcement authorities, and she was really a brave woman, and she is a brave woman, and she will be a brave woman, and what we got from her so far is just the part of her life career. Ladies and gentlemen, As I say, Andrea is a brave woman. He always been. Andrea has her views, but above all, she has the perfect understanding of what is expected from the functions and from the civil servant. She is institutional, never making it about herself. She is perfect civil servant. The perfect civil servant is not somebody who is just blindly following the line, but someone who merges a personal input with the modest sense of being a part of something bigger. She was a part of something bigger, being in the law enforcement authorities. She was part of something bigger when she was in Austrian authority, and she is now at the moment when we are giving the award to her here at the Global Privacy Assembly. I always get emotional when I think about Giovanni's input, and I believe that he would be very happy of that, because Andrea and Giovanni share the mutual appreciation of one another and represent true believers and defenders of the European project and the European approach to data protection and personal data. Andrea, with this award, we are saying that you were the great inspiration for us. You are and you will be the inspiration for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And now I have the great pleasure of announcing that we are ahead of schedule. So we will have a slightly longer lunch resuming at 1 p.m. So I look forward to continuing our conversation then. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Maike Kamp. I am the Berlin Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information. Dear colleagues, many greetings from Berlin to Bermuda. I would like to bring to your attention a very significant draft of European legislation. As part of the EU's package to strengthen democracy and electoral integrity, the EU Commission has presented a draft regulation on transparency and targeting of political advertising in November 2021. Since the draft is not part of the digital package of the European Union, it flies a bit under the radar in data protection circles. At the same time, this draft regulation affects one of the most important data protection issues on the internet. Why is that? Because it deals in particular with specifications for targeting and amplification of messages and content that can affect the political opinion forming process of each individual. The European Commission has seen a need for regulation, since the personal data collected directly from citizens or derived through their online activity, as well as behavioral profiling and other analysis, are used to target political messages to citizens. This information is also used to amplify impact and circulation by tailoring the content and its dissemination on the basis of characteristics determined through the processing of these personal data and their analysis. Policymakers can use micro-targeting technologies to spread conflicting messages to different groups or individuals of potential voters based on the assessment what they most likely would agree to. People can be addressed with that content on those occasions to which they are particularly receptive and online. The algorithmic recommendations of information also increase the reach and visibility of messages. That is what is behind the amplification algorithms. These are designed to keep people using the online platform in order to maximize advertising profits. What is algorithmically flushed into the foreground also gives the impression of being generally relevant. The risk of misinformation and the targeted manipulation of voters is correspondingly high. that has specific and detrimental effects on citizens' fundamental rights and freedoms with regard to the processing of personal data. Their rights to be treated fairly and equally, not to be manipulated, to receive objective information, to form their opinion freely, to make political decisions and exercise their voting rights can be infringed. This can negatively affect the democratic process. Misleading or obscure advertising for political purposes is a risk because it influences the core mechanisms that enable the functioning of our societies and increase the risk of spreading disinformation. Therefore, we see that data protection regulation serves an important purpose here, because processing of personal information is the basis for all these activities. Therefore, the regulation needs to safeguard the possibility to obtain objective information and to preserve the right to freely form an opinion and political will. Against this background, the EU Commission presented the draft regulation on political targeting that is currently in the European lawmaking process. In this context, it is discussed that the existing possibilities under the GDPR to lawfully tailor advertising to individuals and to address it to them are subject to systematic abuse, especially with regard to obtaining consent. A large number of different actors, for example, advertisers, online tracking services, online platforms, are usually involved in the targeted selection, displaying advertisement, and addressing of users. The complex data processing and data flows within those online advertising networks are almost impossible for individuals to understand. Nevertheless, data subjects are often forced to consent. Consequences can neither be assessed nor is it possible to control whether data processing is actually adapted to the data subject's decision. Thus, self-determined informed consent to data processing becomes a fiction. The concept of consent under the GDPR reaches its limits here. The higher the degree of complexity of the processing situation, the less likely it is that the consent will be effective. So it is discussed to provide for legal measures such as increasing the number of recipients, limiting the categories of personal information used for profiling and targeting, prohibiting the use of very sensitive information, to create an environment in which consent can once again take effect in its true sense. The complexity and depth of data processing should be legally contained in such a way that it is comprehensible for the individual and can actually be controlled by consent. However, the consent problem described above affects not only targeting and amplification in the area of political advertising, but all areas and networks in which micro-targeting technologies are used. Whether the proposed approach to political targeting will be approved and serve as a model for regulation in Europe in other areas remains to be seen. I hope you have a wonderful time at the GPA. Take care and bye-bye from Berlin.
Right now, and I mean this instant, delete every digital trace of any menstrual tracking. This was the expression published on Twitter by Gina Neff, professor of technology at the University of Oxford, last year after the Supreme Court of the United States revoked Roe versus Wade decision, which gave constitutional status to the right to abortion in this country. Roe versus Wade recognized that women have the right to make sexual and reproductive decisions, such as termination of pregnancy, as a derivative of the right to privacy. With that decision to overturn this historic ruling, abortion is no longer considered a constitutional right, and it will be up to each state to set the limits it wishes to impose on pregnant women. This case opened the doors for us to analyze aspects from FemTech, from privacy perspective. I am referring to the menstrual cycle applications that emerge as a simple solution to make control over our body. These applications allow you to schedule menstrual cycles and track them during the phases of the cycle to know, for example, the regularity of a period, know which are the fertile days, or know the days of ovulation. The facilities they offer are key for many women who want to become pregnant or to prevent pregnancy. In 2019, after a study by the Privacy International Organization, it was revealed that these applications collected information about sexual life, masturbation habits, or the use of contraceptives. Information that was accessible to others and vulnerable to attacks. Meanwhile, a 2023 report by the International Digital Accountability Council found that menstruation trackers were sending personal information unencrypted or sharing data with third parties without fully disclosing it in their privacy policies. To fully understand what is behind many of these applications, the British media The Guardian in 2019 revealed that one of the most popular fertility apps for women was financed by people who support politicians who promote lines contrary to the birth control and abortion. It is not a few fact that the excessive collection of data by these platforms responds to industries focused on the manufacturing of feminine products. The FemTech or women's health technology market has not stopped growing. On the contrary, over time, all kinds of needs have been created, generating an exponential increase in this industry, since it is a business that moves millions of dollars in the world. Figures from the Macquarie University of Australia from the Cybersecurity Center published in the British magazine BMJ in 2022 indicate about these free applications. One, that 88% include listens that allow you to share information with third parties, that is practically 9 out of 10 women. Two, 88% of these apps did not have privacy policy. And three, that 23% communicated their data in an insurance way. The developers try to monetize these free apps with nutrition data, menstrual cycles, and pass it on to third parties who may be companies, research, but they may also be insurance companies that use these technologies to select their clients and manage their business. But what is really worrying here is what these investigations reveal, that conservative groups could be behind the financing of platforms that collect data of a strictly sensitive nature. Given the lack of guarantees regarding the management of all the information collected by menstrual cycle apps, what happens if tomorrow, due to some policy requirement, women who require an abortion in the United States begin to be persecuted and these apps finally transformed into a technology at the service of surveillance? In brief, in conclusion, to summarize, we want FemTech, but before that, we want respect for the privacy and protection of women's personal data. Thank you so much for your attention.